facilitated discussions, and then the table as a group filled out their own budget as well. So we saw actually what people's priorities were from taking these worksheets and coding them. A lot of intern hours went into that, and then visualizing them and presenting those results to Mary and the policy teams at the individual offices. And one interesting side effect here that we did not expect to see is that we kind of saw, since there is the change, the presentations in between these two budgets, we kind of saw who of the presenters maybe did a better job advocating for their agencies. So shout out here to the Deputy Mayor for Health and Human Services and for the GovOps cluster, because I think they did a good job. I want to switch gears here a little bit too and talk about how to build data into the policymaking process. And if you're lucky, like me, to have colleagues or bosses who really value data-driven policymaking and who want to make their policymaking more data-driven, or who are frequently asking questions where data is a possible answer, the difficulty becomes more setting up a system where the right data is always readily available. And I think the problem, at least for me, is that when we're looking at something so big like DC's economy, there are a lot of different data sources available that I need to kind of be up on and know and be able to look at on a regular basis. So I think here, in particular, a dashboard can be one answer, but I want to say also that I think a lot of the time, when someone asks for a dashboard, the assumption is if you make a dashboard, it's going to magically make your organization more data-driven overnight, like magic, and that is absolutely 100% not the case. I think there are two particular reasons a dashboard can be useful for a policymaker, and to use the actual car dashboard analogy, number one, if you're driving a car and you're looking at the dashboard only, you're going to crash. There are so many other inputs into the decision making when you're driving a car on the street. So a dashboard is one of those. And it might be, first of all, to take a look at the dashboard and see, all right, does this car have 10,000 miles on it or 100,000 miles? As an initial order of magnitude type context setting. And in my case, that might mean the first time someone sees the dashboard that we put together, all right, the split in DC between public sector jobs and private sector jobs is about 40-60. Or the unemployment rate in DC. Does anybody know what the unemployment rate in DC is right now? 7? I heard 7. Anyone? No? Close. 7. It's actually 6% right now, but I think when I first moved to DC, I had no idea whether it was 4 or 11. You know, so that initial context setting, what's the order of magnitude of what we're dealing with here? And then as a quick reference too, if you have a dashboard, it's showing the same thing all the time. It's consistent. You know where to go when you need a piece of information. You know to look at your dashboard to see, is your gas 3/4 full or is it empty? Should I make a decision based on that? But what I don't think a dashboard is an input to ongoing regular policy decisions. It's not informing every single decision. And it shouldn't, because it's, at least in my case, showing major macro trends. It can be useful for figuring out, all right, do we need to dig a little deeper into this? What I think a dashboard is most useful for, honestly, is the creator of the dashboard. I gave a similar talk like this to a different conference, and I asked folks, all right, raise your hand if you have created a dashboard. And maybe like 2/3 of the hands went up in the room. And then I asked everyone, all right, raise your hand if you regularly check someone else's dashboard, a dashboard someone else has made. All the hands went down. One person, I think, kept their hand up, and I don't know if they were joking or not, but honestly, I don't. The dashboard that I created is most helpful for me Number one, for the initial process of building it, asking those important questions like, what data is important? What questions do we get regularly? What do I need to know on a daily basis to know if DC's economy is healthy? And then on an ongoing basis, as a regular prompt for me to look at the data and keep monitoring and then know, is there something important that I need to figure out a way to communicate up to the people in the context that matters? And honestly, not everyone likes pictures. Not everyone gets their input from charts and graphs. And so when I see something that's concerning to me, I put it out in various different mediums. I send an email. I send another email. I send a third email. Need to hammer this story home if it's important. I send out a picture to those for whom I think that a picture will make the most sense. At the when we were developing the mortgage monitoring dashboard, we had a weekly call because people really value the input that you can give them voice to voice or face to face. And what people were really looking for wasn't charts, graphs, facts, but your analysis of it. That I think is a huge value add, and the dashboard gives me a prompt to figure out what my story is and what my analysis is of the data on a weekly basis. And I'll just close by a few bullet points here on I think what makes a good dashboard, and make the point here that I think a lot of the time when people are putting together a data dashboard, there is a really, really tempting push to include data that is clean or that updates regularly, because if you're pushing out updates regularly, that makes you feel useful. That makes you feel warm and fuzzy. But is it really useful to be pushing out data that's not relevant just because it updates regularly? I think that's kind of like the story of the drunkard looking for his keys. You know, you go up to him and you say, well, why are you looking for your keys here in the light post? And he says, well, that's where the light is. It's not enough to just use what data is available. If you're really going to make a useful data product, you need to go through that hard process of figuring out what data do we have, what data we don't have, and building an infrastructure where it's readily available. And that honestly can take months and months. It's not an overnight process. And then, like I mentioned before, a dashboard is really like a quick reference, and it can lead you down a lot of other different rabbit holes into more ad hoc analyses to do deeper dive into things that you find concerning or some prompt questions that you might not have had before. So that's another useful bit. But I'll end here and turn it over to back to the moderator to introduce the next presenter. Thank you.
So if you have any burning questions, just hold it a little bit longer, and we'll get to your questions for me. So yeah, that's really exciting, and you know, I stumbled on that website in preparing for this, and it was it's just like an interesting way to kind of like browse through you know, data that I wouldn't think to look at or recognize trends in. So it's really awesome to see. I think it's an exciting time where we can pull data together in that way and you know, do things we couldn't do before. So I think that's sort of like one of the things we're going to talk about throughout the day. So without going on too much longer, I'll introduce the next speaker. Alberto Quadra is the managing editor of graphics for Science Magazine. He creates the visuals for the weekly publication and the website. He's in the past was at the Washington Post and had some award-winning graphics there, and started his career as a reporter. So happy to introduce Alberto to the stage, and excited to hear what he has to say.
good morning, and thank you for being here. If you're not familiar with the area, there's a Starbucks at the Marriott across the street. I've been in the graphics business for almost 2 decades now, and mostly in news organizations. Managing here the graphics team at Science is my first gig in a non-daily publication, and the first time I get to work all Science all the time. As I said, my last employer was the Washington Post, and I want to start my discussion there because there at the Post there's a culture built over years in which data storytelling is almost second nature. Editors, reporters, designers understand the value of data visualization, and not only as a tool for their stories, but also as a fundamental component of their narrative. This culture is well established now, and I had the privilege to see how it took roots over my 5 years tenure there. So when I came here, there was very little of that happening outside the hardcore research material provided by the authors. Getting to build a culture, our own culture, that cultivates visual narratives based on data has been challenging, like every project you start from scratch, but also an extremely rewarding experience with lots of learning moments. I will share some of those with you later, but first, let me, for you who are not familiar with the organization, let me frame a little bit what we do and who we are. Science is one of the 6 journals that the AAAS publishes. We got Science Signaling, we have Translational Medicine, Science Technology, Robotics, and Advances, which I don't have a cover there because they don't have a cover. Science is the only one that have both digital and print edition. We are a small team, 9 people, with very different backgrounds and skills. We have scientific illustrators, we have graphic designers, we have one interactive / web developer / designer, and myself, who is a journalist by formation and most of my career. We produce lots of explanatory graphics for our new session. We do, of course, covers. We also create a lot of what we call perspectives, which are these visual pieces related to research papers. And more data visualization pieces. I say more and more because now, every time we publish one, there's almost immediately propositions from the researchers and writers to create new ones. So they see more and more data sets that can be useful for their storytelling. And that is what we wanted from the start. We wanted to create this culture building project. And around the organization, there's now a sense that data visualization can do. And like in other publications before us, this knowledge is becoming an integral part of how we tell stories. Getting to this point had been a process that took a lot of learning, and each organization that goes through a similar journey will have their own experiences. I'm very aware of that, but possibly very different from ours. But I think there are some basics that might help us, help you to try to introduce or consolidate your visual data storytelling. We found out that you need to have a consistent design. And the most practical reason for that is that it saves time and it saves effort in the creation process. not having to constantly have to reinvent color patterns and designs and set design styles for our visualizations eliminates a good amount of pressure in the initial stages of creating formulations. Also, this consistent look helps to integrate data-driven stories in other more explanatory components of our pieces. We like to think that our visualizations have a unique style that our readers recognize immediately and find them, as Marie says, memorable. We also find out that our readers need to be guided somehow. We think about data stories. When we think about data stories, we immediately think about exploration. The viewer is presented with information and ultimately draws his own conclusions from data. But in our experience, directing the audience to certain areas of the visualization, eliminating the clutter, guiding its interaction with the graphic, hugely helps to get the point through. Sometimes this means just a simple change of color in our graphics, like this one. So the bubbles represent the number of cases of several infectious diseases. And you can see how they decrease over time, at least most of them, dramatically. But by highlighting the moment in which vaccines were introduced in the timeline, just by changing some bubbles with orange, we are guiding the narration to a specific point. Sometimes we use interactivity as the right tool to direct the attention of the reader. In this graphic, which isn't interactive, I'm sorry I didn't include anything outside the PowerPoint presentation because I wasn't sure that we were going to be linked back and forward to them. But this is an interactive graphic. And in this one, we added a clickable timeline as a vehicle to push the attention towards the story. So if you see the progression of the graphic and you click in the last point or the last 2 points of the interactive, you can appreciate, you can see that the Viking settlers in Greenland diminished in the starting in the 1200s, coinciding with changing weather patterns, right? Storminess in this case, and also that there's a drastic change in their diet that goes from land animals to mostly marine fish and things that good find in the sea. We also try to control sometimes the experience of the visualization with self-run animations, right, or self-run graphics. In this example, as the points in the timeline progress, the ranking of companies start to move accordingly. That way, the user not only can explore the data, but also direct it to a point of the article, which is that only a handful of companies historically are responsible for 20% of carbon emissions in the planet. We find out also that data can be beautiful. Again, when we think about data storytelling, we don't normally relate it to aesthetics. But we know that pursuing a visually pleasant representation of data can not only greatly enhance the reader's experience, but also help to understand the topic at hand. This cover is both. It's an illustration and a data visualization piece. We use actual data from NASA's MAVEN probe Mars to plot the trajectory of atmospheric particles blown by the solar wind. We have learned that this marriage of design and scientific data is pleasant to the eye and effective at relaying information. Innovation. you need constantly to update your tool set and try new approaches to data visualization. So in this business, conformity usually means irrelevance. It also means that you might be doing things more difficult than they have to, or spending more time that you need to. For example, we have been using Tableau for a while to create our initial database designs and share them with the editors before the final version. But we also found that it was a huge time saver and a perfectly fine tool for final publication of interactives. This is an example in which we plotted thousands of data points in a map using Tableau for the main visual component of the page. We even created an animation. But finally, CartoDB for the additional interactives. So these pre-packages, tools are fine, and they can support the same, and there's no shame in using them as long as the job gets done. We obviously also use D3 in our visualizations, but also trying to use this library with an original design that sometimes drives us crazy in the creation process. We also are using more and more Python in combination with 3D packages that allow us to use real data with our graphics. This cover was done in Singapore in Python to plot the migratory movements of researchers around the world. As we find out too, it's not limited to tools, but also means exploring the media itself that we are embedded in to tell data stories. This is our last effort in Nashville, the X project, as we call it, or our digital media director calls Proyecto Huevos. And we did this in this case to try to immerse the reader in the full visual experience around research paper, with all the weapons in our arsenal, interactives, video, photograph, data viz, the navigation itself of the web, and 3D, of course. This is something we never tried before. We normally we find easier to, or more conductive to create this kind of pieces for news topics, but doing this for a research paper specifically was an experiment and a very successful one. This project also forced us to design from scratch a new static template and write a different style that would effectively merge with the narration of the graphics and effectively combine different visual elements in a single narrative. I invite you all of you to. This is way much better than see the static image that you click and take a look at the project itself. And finally, if you guys are interested in what we're doing lately, and we regularly post at Science Visuals, so follow us and tell us what you think. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Actually, you could just grab a seat right up there, and I'll ask Marie to come back up, and we'll have some discussion and open the floor for questions. I think we need this for the remote sound. So I guess I'll get like a thumbs up or something. That's working. All right. Well, thanks a lot, guys. Very excited to see your presentations and excited to talk with you about the diverse backgrounds and audiences that you work with. And so I think the big question for me is to sort of talk through the process that you have in your teams about what comes first, and how do you know that, how do you sort of build a data story? I mean, is it a question? Is it, you know, a policy? Is it a data source for, I mean, I think like, so I'll open up to you first, and then to Alberto, just to sort of talk through how you recognize when you have a data story, because I think that's a valuable, you know, skill to learn.
Yeah, I think it can come from any of those two sources you mentioned. It could come from a new data source that you recently opened up to the public. We've done hackathons and kind of data-based hackathons where we make a data that tell us what you can see, and we've seen pretty awesome things come out of that. A policy, obviously, when you're weighing two different directions or a million different directions, you could go with policy data, and searching for the right data is often how these questions come up. Or honestly, things that we see in the data that we're regularly looking at that concern us, that's a lot of the time a question comes up, and we have to search for more data to answer that question. And more than half of the time, there's no story there, which is fine. I don't think that it's a waste of time to explore several hypotheses and see, oh, actually, this isn't of great concern. Or to explore a little bit and find, oh, you know what, there's no data actually that will answer this question. And then it's a calculation, is it worth it to kind of seek out a new data source or make a new data source that will answer this question in the future? So any direction, honestly. It just depends on what your priority is.
It varies a lot, but basically there's obviously some kind of news piece. There's some pitch, and then we normally it depends on the data set. So we receive the data set and we tend to clean it up, analyze it, see what is the point, right? What we have to push through the data, and I mean, maybe push is the wrong word. I mean, what we have to show, right? And from there is a constant loop of feedback back and forward, trying to, so we are creating the visualization and we're showing this design, this is what you expect data, and the editor, the writer, come back to us with some, you know, this may not be the right areas to highlight, this may not be the right way to display it, and we push back and they push back. It's like it's a process that it takes some time, but the central point is always, of course, the data. And as Marie pointed out, sometimes we're presented with data sets that are very difficult to use with the story, and we have to. Sometimes it's not possible. Sometimes the data sets that just not out there. There's missing data. There's gaps. So we have to rethink the sources and to ask for other stuff.
I love that point. Oh, sorry, can I make one more point? I love the point you made on the feedback cycle, because I think the first draft is never going to be, it's never going to be the best. And we always find that data is more memorable, the visualizations are more poignant when we've had people kind of use or test them in a way. So what are you seeing from this data? I'm seeing this, this, and this, but I don't get this, this, and this. Seeing how people accept what you're showing them is hugely important in the process, because that's going to make or break the point that you're trying to make in that too. Yeah, and we try to do that.
And also what to, right? I mean, their data sets are wrong to be displayed more statically, and some others are they're ready to be animated, or so it's a long process of a lot of ideas pouring on you until you get the final direction.
Yeah, it sounds so. It's an iterative process. So in that, at what point do you start to think about, and maybe it's at the very beginning, but maybe it's somewhere in the middle, about the audience and the data literacy for different types of visualizations. And I think you could both talk to this with your different audiences, and maybe especially you coming from the post to a more science-attuned audience. Some thoughts?
So this is what as you said, you know, at the post or municipal in general, science is very generalistic. Is really you have to. I mean, basically because I'm not a journalist, and most of the people who I'm not a scientist, and most of the people who work on newspapers and guys teams are scientists. So the first filter is ourselves understanding what we're explaining, and you know it normally works. But here in science, there's like two tiers, right? So we have an audience, a more journalistic audience that can access to the website from anywhere, and then we have the audience that which is highly specialized and highly educated, and the visualization can be very different in nature, and because the eggs example is a research paper. I mean, there's nothing there that is not already explained. But sometimes you have to rehash or make it easier for the general audience to understand certain concepts, certain solutions. And it's always, I mean, the help of the experts, the people who work at science, the editors, is paramount. They are our graphics whisperers. They're people who really can explain to us what we're doing, what we're trying to.
Yeah, I think their feedback is really important. I guess in the journalistic context, you can see like the analytics for the web article and see how many clicks are happening, or you can see the comment section, or you might not want to. But in communicating data to folks in a policy-making context, these are my colleagues, and so it's a lot of trial and error to see whose style is which, who would prefer to receive information in a graphic versus in an email. I work with a lot of lawyers who I think, if I can make this generalization, really prefer to see things in words, honestly. So I do a lot of writing up my conclusions after I've kind of seen them, because I'm more a visual person, after I've seen them in the data, and figuring out ways to ask for feedback on the conclusions that you're making and that you're putting out. I think it's also a useful tool to use graphics when you're having policy discussions too. So like having a really quick iteration of, well, this is what the data says, like a really quick cut. I know recently we were having a discussion about seasonal adjustment and whether to report out adjusted or non-adjusted numbers, and it was so helpful and could have saved a lot of emails back and forth to just have the picture right in front of us. So it's also a tool for discussion. But I think the most valuable thing that I've learned about communicating data to people in policy is that you need to have a variety of different mediums available to you. So all face-to-face. There's a reason people in press conferences bring those big words of graphics. I mean, it can work for certain people.
Mm-hmm. How about we open up the floor to the audience? If you have a question, there's two mics on either side. You can just go up and stand behind it. Sarah?
Yeah, I have a question from WebEx. Do you start with a visualization in mind or sketch, or with the tools that you would build?
Sketch. Yeah. I mean, the sketch is like is like the skeleton of everything. I mean, you need to somehow initially plot it, even manually. You see what's available, what is that, and once you determine that, you can sketch something. I have examples of graphics that went from a Sankey to whatever, a completely different visualization, and in that process you sketch. And so sketch is the very thing that is going to jumpstart the discussion, is going to jumpstart with people who are not in visual, right? So we can show them what we're trying to do, and sketch is fundamental. And then you choose the tools, and then you have to figure out, well, how we're going to transform the data into this.
I think my process is probably a bit different. I think I more so start with a question, or a few questions that I have, and then use whatever tools I can and whatever data I can to start answering those questions bit by bit, and then a sketch will come to me of what I want the eventual end graphic to look like. I think what I do is probably a bit more simple in general than what you're producing too. A lot of what we do is, it can be done by simple tabulations, honestly, and doesn't generally involve any regressions or any more complicated statistical work too. So that's why I think the sketch comes a bit later for me, but always our questions.
Yeah, different organizations, different processes.
Yep.
Yes, sir. Please state your name and then your question.
My name is Stuart Will, and thank you both on the detailed topic, except that I'm on topic with the actual name, session, why data. You both gave excellent examples of data separate points in sort of internal another sort of audience that perhaps increasingly need to brush up their skills are scientists, community, or scientists themselves who are addressing which is great. If you could give only one bit of advice to those people, easy answers.
Well, I was afraid of that question. I know. I think we always obviate that the main question of this panel, which is what this whole thing is, why data story, and we obviate this because in what we do, we think from the get-go that and I mentioned it a little bit that it's fundamental to communicate our narratives now that we need data stories. We need we consume data every day through our eyes, and data visualization and data driven stories are a very powerful tool to communicate that. And applied to science, it's basically a no-brainer, right? So science generates huge amounts of data, and data stories are I will say a native narrative for science. What I always say to somebody who is not familiar with visual and I've never had this mindset is that you have to take the leap. You have to think visually a little bit, or at least initially. So if you are very knowledgeable of data, you see increases, you see trends, you see something that be translatable into visuals, think about it. Take that leap. Not just give the data to the specialist, but also you make your own interpretation. It may be undoable. It may be not the right way to do it, but at least you have a sense of what you want us to do, what you want the specialist to do, and that's extremely helpful. That's a very good start, and it also starts a relationship with us that it really is conducive to a better work and a better workflow. So I think that's the very first step before even starting to talk about tools or things that you need to. I think that as always, I talk about culture, and I think that's fundamental for us. It's been fundamental. In every organization I've been working for, culture is what conducts everything else.
Well, if I'm thinking about communicating science or data to non-scientists or non-data people, a lot of the difficulty maybe in communicating complexity in a very simple way, and communicating findings in a scientific paper with the format is absolutely going to fall flat for people who are not used to ingesting conclusions in that format. So I think, first of all, it helps to ask questions of your audience. Talk to them. What do they want to know? What's important to them? If you can't, at least put yourselves in the shoes of your audience as a thought exercise. Take off your scientist hat, forget all of your scientific background for a moment, if that's possible, and say, what would be important to me if I'm Joe or Jane citizen? One thing that I learned, just as a rule of thumb, I think, from going from a more scientific academic environment to a policy environment, is to communicate my conclusions in like a big, small, big kind of way. So I'll start off with the big conclusion first, explore a little with some more specifics in the middle, open time for questions, feedback, end with the big conclusion in the end too. So you have a little room to convey the complexity or even the uncertainty of your findings, which is important. But really what's going to be memorable is the beginning and the end.
All right, well, thanks a lot. We only have a minute or so left. I'll just let you close with anything you want to say, and maybe say something about what you think the trends or where we're going in the next couple of years in the space of data visualization, and you know, what excites you about this.
There's more and more tools, obviously. I mean, technology is pushing us, and is making our life a lot easier. I mean, we can plot stuff now in minutes that took a long time. And also, I think the trend is that the data-driven stories, data visualization, are becoming a common feature of pretty much every organization, is everywhere, and there's an awareness that there wasn't years ago.
So I'll note two things. One is open data. In DC, we actually just finalized our first data policy, which could be subheaded open data policy, where every data set produced by government is considered open by default. And we're going through the exercise right now of producing a data inventory and then deciding which data sets are too sensitive maybe to release. But everything that the DC government produces data-wise will be open to the public in a matter of months, years. So open data and the responsibility that comes with releasing data. I think a policy challenge right now is how to figure out how you communicate the complexities and caveats of the data to the eventual users. Secondly, I think data journalism is at an absolutely fantastic place right now, and I think we should all be striving to emulate what's going on at the Post, at Science, at the Times, and Bloomberg, for example, because that's going to be kind of the de facto language, I think, of how people consume data, because it's so ubiquitous, and that we should really be trying to make our visualizations as wonderful as you all are making them, really.
Well, thank you. I can't think of a better way to end. You know, we'll lead into the next session and get more into the details of how we can all do this thing. So we're going to have a 20-minute break and come back at 10:20. So join me in thanking our speakers here in our first session.
So first of all, what was the success for doing this project? So we got word that Obama White House was going to introduce a clean power plan So this was plan climate change by using carbon output from power plants. So we got word of this embargoed just about a day before it was going to be announced. So we knew there was going to be a story coming. We knew it was coming, I believe, at midnight on a Sunday. We got word of this on Friday morning, and we knew that we'd probably do something visual to accompany this story. We knew it was going to be a traditional story that the text explains the issue, but we thought we could really have an opportunity to add something by making that. And it turns out that we had already, our team had already done something like this about a year ago. I wasn't even on the team yet when we started working on this project, but two of my colleagues had an idea that it actually looks pretty cool when you take all of the power plants in the United States on a big map. It kind of looks like a Jackson Pollock painting. It's not necessarily the most easily understandable graphic, but certainly eye-catching, and it does give you a kind of picture of the broad geographic trends. But when they did this, there wasn't really necessarily a what we call a news tag for telling the story. But we knew the data existed. We had an idea. We had a starting visual idea. So so here we are. We have like a day and a half to make something. So one of my colleagues, Dan Keating, he specializes in data analysis. He brought in the latest data from the Energy Information Administration. Fortunately, it's pretty easy to work with that data. That's one of the reasons it's possible to do this. And we started Iterative. We knew we wanted to do something with some sort of small multiples. We knew we couldn't just go with that one graphic because it's actually not super clear in all areas where the pool distribution is complex. So we knew we wanted to do some small multiples. We didn't know for sure where we wanted to put them. One early idea was to put all of the maps at the top of the page, and then actually let you click on those maps and filter the big map. Went back and forth on that. One reason we didn't go with that was because it wasn't clear how that was going to work on the phone. We tried different orientations of these. But ultimately we realized we needed a little more space because we wanted to actually talk about each of these maps. We didn't just want to show the chart. So this was essentially the design that went in the print newspaper, and we realized that would actually work pretty well on the web. So we ultimately came up with something that looked like this. My colleague Sam Lograndos made some cool icons for each of the power types, and then we had a big map. One of the challenges we had was that the original code to make this map was written in D3. And the advantage of that was we could pretty easily make it interactive. But the challenge was that when I tried to load it on an iPad or a phone, or even my fancy new MacBook Pro, it was pretty slow. And so we knew performance was going to be an issue, and we didn't really have enough time to fix that. So we just turned it into a big image and ran with that. We didn't make it interactive at all. We just ran with it, and it was good enough for what we were doing. Later on, after we published it, then I went back and actually added some interactive features. Then you'll notice that there's an update to the story. So the Obama regulation faced a lot of court challenges, and then it was finally rolled back by the Trump administration this year. We had gotten a lot of requests even last year to update this chart, so we decided we would make a new version of the piece. And so we did this. We added that line chart at the bottom. So I'll go through the piece as it is on the web. Okay, so so we start with the big eye-catching visual at the top. There's some introductory text. We have a line chart here that shows you some history of how the share of electricity generation has changed. The big story is that natural gas overtakes coal. And then we have this interactive that shows you what the share of electricity generation is in each state. So what this map shows you is not electricity generation, but it's capacity of power plants. So that doesn't tell you the whole story. But this gives you a clear picture of how electricity is actually generated in each state, and you can sort it by each type of power. And you can mouse over it and then see all the details for each state. And then we have this is the storytelling portion. This is where we go from the general to the specific, where we talk about each type of power in turn. So it's that simple structure, but it's clear. I think it works pretty well. This gives you a broad overview of the entire piece. So you can see the structure. And you can see how we've changed up, we've added a kind of dynamic of different chart sizes. And then I have each of these chart types here. So I'll go a little bit into the feedback we got quickly. So here are some comments on the piece. I usually try to avoid reading comments, but it is important to see what your readers are thinking, and they do actually often have some valuable feedback. So the first one wants to know how this has changed. Yep, that's a great idea. So we added a little line chart that shows that. This person wants to know what does the power grid look like across the country. That's another great idea. And then this last one, this graph badly needs a zoom feature. That was a little bit out of it. It's also a good idea, but technically challenging to implement. And so we haven't done that yet, maybe in the future. Some people tweeting about this. So I like what this guy did, because he tweeted something specific about a specific state. Maybe he's from there, and so he's interested in what share is in his state. So he was able to find some personal information using this interactive. And then this person points out, maybe rightly, that little line chart, that's actually the interesting story here. So I think he's right. One reason we didn't do that is because we were iterating on a past piece, which was about the geography of power generation, not necessarily the change over time. We had that in. So but it's definitely an interesting story. So the lessons we learned from this, find your audience. So when we did this chart, we knew there was, as I said, a news peg. We knew people were going to be interested in this because of the announcement of the Clean Power Plan. but it's actually been shared. I mean, a couple of people share this on Twitter every month, and lots of people are interested in this topic. Timing for relevancy, that's that news peg idea. The minimum viable graphic. Realize that not every piece of this had to be interactive. We realized that it was important to hit that timing rather than make it perfect, make it exactly the way we wanted it, but tell the story. And then if you can, making your graphic personal will make it resonate with people because they can, they can find information specific to the place where they live, for instance. And we're not the only ones who have visualized the data set. Allison Hurt at NPR did these around the same time we did our graphics. She did these slope charts. I think this is another really great way to show the data. And we didn't initially do that change over time. So this tells you a different, but also a really interesting story about how the United States generates its electricity. And then I think using some of this feedback from the piece, we realized there was a lot of interest in infrastructure and specifically power generation. So Tim Miko did some great infrastructure maps, including this one of electric transmission lines. Here's a map of coal jobs in Appalachia. And here's a view of natural gas flares across North America. So that's all I have for now, but I'll welcome your questions later on.
Thank you, John. Do they have a real quick question that they can get themselves to the mic in the next 5 seconds to ask? And I'll ask a quick one, actually. So I am currently doing a lot of transportation and international development work. I work for the Millennium Challenge Corporation, which is a U.S. foreign assistance agency. But before that, I did a lot of energy policy work. And one thing I was interested in was everybody always shows coal in gray, which I think is like, people expect that, right? So like, but I'm wondering, so it's helping people find in your visual, but maybe we can talk later, or you can offer a comment now if you want about the other kind of biases that puts in, like what people think about the color gray. I don't even know that I have a sense of whether people think of gray as negative, but yeah, I don't know if you get, when you're thinking about colors, like how do you pick natural gas as orange also?
That's a good point. So the color decisions were made they were partially made by one of my editors, well, designed by and some of them have some obvious connections to the energy, or they complement the icon. But yeah, color choice is very important. We can start that now. We can actually color line, and so that's why we have to have those individual maps later on.
Right.
But yeah, certainly color choice.
Yeah. And I'll make a plug. There's an online tool that it might be Color Brewer, it might be a different one, but there's if you just Google, colorblind friendly graphics, there's a way to, if you take a normal graph where the colors you have a lot of flexibility with, then you can make them safe for folks. So the next speaker we're going to have is a colleague of mine, Michael Pack. He is the director of the CAT Lab, which is a transportation data visualization and analysis group at the University of Maryland. And I met him about 2 years ago because we're both transportation geeks. And he's got a lot of interesting things to share, not only in transportation, but also how he's working with his team of computer scientists and engineers, students, and even social scientists and other folks working to build tools to improve transportation operations and make data usable and understandable. So Michael, if you'd come join us.
University of Maryland, and we want to provide an overview of data, an overview of all your data in some sort of picture, then allow you to be able to zoom in and bring up details on demand. So paint a picture of the data, allow people to then use their eyes and the tools to go in and ask other questions. So with that, I'm going to show you a couple of use cases, a couple of stories that our clients are interested in. One of those is about where there's safety issues and mobility challenges on the roadway, and how do you know if you're spending your money wisely to solve those problems? The next is collisions. If there's a collision out on the roadway, how do you know what the impact is? How can you figure out if you responded to that collision, that accident appropriately? Did you have an impact? Was it a positive impact? Was it a negative impact? And then also some analytics that will help us look at travel and fatalities out on the roadway. So the first thing is congestion analytics. So it might surprise people, maybe not, that in the past, when there's congestion out on the roadway, you'd think that all the DOTs in the country would just know where the problems are, they would know how bad they are, and then they would know how to spend money to fix that. Well, what generally happens, especially in the past, is it might be whichever congressman was complaining the most. That might be where the DOT then had to focus their money, not necessarily because they thought that was the worst congested location or most dangerous location on the roadway, but they didn't have the data to support any other rationale. They'd have to go out, do some sort of traffic study at that location. That study might take several months to complete, and they spent a lot of money doing that study. They couldn't study every single place in the state, and so they ended up having to spend additional dollars to go fix the congestion. Well, we have now developed this tool at the university that allows any state DOT in the country to go to our website, click a couple of buttons, and in about 10 minutes, we've ranked the worst congested location in the entire state. And it goes in and it will give you stats for each of those locations, telling you, for this location, which is the fourth most congested location in the state of Maryland, it'll tell you how many miles that queue usually backs up, when it backs up, how many hours it's been congested on average for every day, how many days it's been congested for the month or the year that you're in a query, how many collisions or fatal accidents or disabled vehicles have occurred in that location as well. And then it gives you other graphics, interactive graphics, that tell you when this location was congested. So this is like a 24-hour clock, where the innermost revolution is going to be day 1. So what is this? October. So the innermost revolution would be October 1st, and October 2nd, October 3rd, October 31st should be the outside ring. Any time there's color that's popping up on this graphic, that's when this location is messed up. So you can see it's kind of like 5 days in a weekend, 5 days in a weekend, 5 days in a weekend. And it's generally between 3 o'clock and 7 o'clock almost every single day. Sometimes you have these outlier events where it's a little congested in the morning, sometimes it's congested in the evening, possibly because there's some construction or something going on at that location. I actually have the real deal up right here. This is not an HD projector, so it's going to be real hard to see this. But you can go in and you can click on each of the locations. As you click on each location, it gives you a different pattern for when it's congested, shows you where they are. You can then overlay on top of this where the events or incidents are occurring, whether it's construction or collisions or fatalities, what have you. If you see one of these outliers and you want to know more about it, you click on it, and then it draws a diagram of the road for you, showing you each of the intersections along the way, shows you the congestion, shows you the incidents that might be contributing to the congestion, and then you click on the incident, and then it generates a graphical timeline of how this particular incident was managed, when responders arrived on the scene, what did they do, all sorts of other stuff. I'll go into that a little bit more later. Go back to the presentation. So then we give our users the power to press another button, and that button then goes out and says, okay, well, we know there were 100,000 people out on the roadway at this location for this particular hour. They were expecting to go the speed limit, which was 60 miles per hour, but instead they had to go 30 miles per hour. Well, we all have a value associated with our time, and so if we know that it took you twice as long, maybe you were going to spend an hour on the roadway, but you end up having to spend 2 hours on the roadway, now you've wasted an hour of your valuable time. That has an actual economic impact. And so we can give you a table that tells you by hour day, by day of week, each hour, how many tens or hundreds of thousands of dollars are being wasted out of that particular location. This is just personal value of time. This does not include fuel consumption and emissions and all the other interesting indicators that are out there. And you can break it down in terms of commercial vehicle delay versus you and me delay that's out there. And then another couple of clicks, you can then generate maps that show you, for whichever road you're interested in, how much congestion is on those roads. This is a particular road up in New Jersey that was congested on weekends every time someone went to the beach. They had a whole bunch of traffic lights on this particular stretch of road. So then what happens is the DOTs figure out where these congested locations are, and then they allocate money to try to fix problems. And then they spend that money, and then they can go back and they can use these tools after the fact to show if that user delay cost has now gone down, if it's gone up, sometimes that happens, or if they just push the problem down the road to someone else. So here, here's the maps of congestion before this particular construction project, and here's the map after. There are times when you normally have congestion. You could do the same thing with the user delay cost tables and the bottleneck tools as well. But the real storytelling comes in then distilling all of these graphics and all this information down into something that is digestible by the public or decision makers quickly and easily. So we have these project assessment summaries. It's an 11 by 17 sheet of paper. It's a template. It's predefined. It's got places for you to go and write a quick story about what this location is, why it's congested. Then pressing a couple of buttons in our tools, then output different sorts of graphics. There's an inside of this that has other charts and graphs as well, showing you the economic impact. And then it essentially tells you the before conditions, the after conditions, how much of an improvement you had. And these are things you can take around to public meetings and show people, the value that they're getting out of their investments in transportation. So that's one example. Next example is the DOTs are out there trying to manage collisions. It's estimated that collisions on the roadway can be responsible for up to 45% of the congestion that's out there and all the delays that we're facing. So if the DOTs can prevent collisions from happening in the first place, or if they can get rid of the collision off the road more quickly, then you have less congestion, less excess fuel consumption, and less secondary accidents that occur as well. So the DOTs need to be able to understand how well they are responding to these incidents to know what they can do to improve. So for every collision that happens down the interstates, we take all of the data, that we're getting from these computer-aided dispatch systems, from the tracking of cell phones and whatnot, and we can create these collision timelines showing how the incident was managed. So this red line out here on the left, that's the start of the incident, and I cannot read the time. Let's pretend that's 4 o'clock. And then this might be 5 o'clock and 6 o'clock and 7 o'clock and 8 o'clock. That would be the end of the incident over here. There's all these little blips that pop up on the screen. These are agencies that are notified about this incident and when they're notified. So this red diamond right there, that's the fire department. It was notified right when the incident started. So for the police department, then there's a dash line that follows. The dash line is when the agency is driving to the scene of the incident. Then the solid line is when they're actually on the scene of the incident. So it looks like the police were there pretty much the whole time. So it was the fire department, hazmat responded to the scene. Here's tow trucks that were notified, how long it took them to get there, when they're on the scene, so on and so forth. Then you can see how the lanes were opened and closed over time. So first, all the lanes in the westbound direction were blocked. Then a little bit later on, the shoulder and a right lane open up. Then a couple of more lanes open up, so on and so forth. And then down below that, again here, down below that, we're then showing you the queues that built up behind the incident as these lanes were blocked and how that changed over time. And there's even communication logs. So these are all of the things that were said on the radio systems. And it's, you know, we put that in a timeline, so you can actually go back and see the flow of communication, flow of information. This helps to then facilitate an after-action review. They talk about what they did well, what they didn't do well. Why did it take us so long to call the towers? Why did we call the wrong tower? They didn't have the right equipment. They had to go back and get some more stuff. But then they can use our bottleneck tools to go in and show, okay, there's an incident here. Where did the bottlenecks form? How are people trying to detour around these incidents? Did we set up the right detour plans? Were we telling them the right thing? Using those maps, we can then show where the congestion was. We can compare the congestion during the incident to what the congestion would have normally been like on the roads. This is like normal traffic. This is the day of the incident traffic. And then we can do the user delay cost comparisons as well. So on a normal day on this road, we see about $6,000 in user delay costs just from normal everyday congestion. But on the day in which we had this particular collision, we had $76,000 in user delay costs. Well, if the law says right now that if you have a fender bender incident on an interstate, you can't touch the vehicles. You got to wait till the police arrive. You got to file a police report. You got to do an accident investigation before you move the car out of the roadway. You're going to have $70,000 or more user delay. What if you can show up and the police officer can just bulldoze the car out of the way? Yeah, you might do a little damage to the car. Yeah, the state might have to pay for some of that damage, or the insurance company might, but it's saving society more money. Now, this is a small example, but I have other after-action reviews for incidents on beltways where you have a lot of traffic, where this number is upwards of $3 million for one incident. I would much rather have the police come and bulldoze my little Prius out of the way, save $3 million. Yeah, it's just a better policy. How much time do I have left? I've got one more story here. So we're trying to figure out traffic incidents, fatalities down the roadway. How can we provide tools that help agencies understand what's going on out on the roadways a little bit better? This is a visual analytics that we created. It starts off by showing you a map of VMT, vehicle miles traveled in the United States. So every time you drive 1 mile on a roadway, that's 1 VMT. For 1 year in the United States, there's 2.9 trillion, 2.9 trillion vehicle miles traveled in the U.S. So we're color coding each of the states based on how much VMT is in each state. So you see California, Texas, Florida have more VMT than anybody else. Give everyone the same spacing there. You can see how much of the VMT is passenger vehicle VMT versus truck VMT. Then we break down the VMT by road class. So like interstates, urban interstates compared to rural interstates, backcountry roads compared to city streets, so on and so forth. How much VMT there is by month. How much VMT there is by day of week. How much VMT there is by hour of day is being cut off down at the bottom, but each one of those is an hour of the day. So then you can go in and say, well, maybe I just care about California. I'll come in and I will, come on mouse, click on California. And so then it highlights how much of this VMT is California. And same thing for all of the other months, days of the week. We can add extra states. We can compare states, see how they interplay with one another. You can come in and zoom in. So maybe I want to look at VMT by day of week. So I'll now go down, look at Sunday only, and then I'll hit play, and it'll cycle through each day of the week, and you know, the map is that exciting, but it is actually updating the numbers and colors in the map. Let me clear that. So pretty basic stuff. Now let's switch over to the number of fatal accidents in each state. So I click over number of fatal accidents. The states that had the most VMT still have the most number of fatal accidents, so Texas is the proud winner here. And you still see passenger fatals higher than truck fatals. The road classes have changed. You all can barely see this, but the hours of day is a little bit more normalized now. You don't have a dip early in the morning, and you have more fatal accidents on Saturday and Sunday. Nothing too fantastic there. Now let's switch to the fatal accident rate. This is how many fatal accidents you have per vehicle mile traveled. All right. Now the passenger fatal rate is lower than the truck fatal accident rate. Also, the math is now messed up. California is no longer the leader. Well, I guess they are, and that they have fewer fatal accidents. But now we see Montana and West Virginia have a much higher fatal accident rate than any of the other states. You can also, well, you can barely see it over here, fatal accident rate, death rate in the morning hours is much worse than the rest of the day. This would be like 12 a.m., 1, 2, 3, 4 a.m. It's higher than the other days. You also have a disparity here in the different types of routes. Now let's come in and let's click on one of these states that has really bad fatal accidents. So let's look at Montana. Click on Montana, and now we see that its passenger fatal accident rate is higher than the national average. Its truck fatal accident rate is lower than the national average, and 12, 1, 2, 3 o'clock in the morning, it's higher than the national average. Let me click on West Virginia, wild and wonderful. Click on that. Now, its truck fatal accident rate is much higher than everybody else's, and its early morning hour fatal accident rates are, a little bit lower than everyone else's, except for the 3 o'clock hour, 3 a.m. And I believe it just so happens that the bars in West Virginia close at 3 a.m., whereas they don't in some of the other states. So that's why that's higher than the national average there. So trying to use these types of analytics, not necessarily to tell the story, but to help others look at the data and figure out what the story is, so they can then go out and tell it themselves. So that's my story. That's what we do. Feel free to send me an email if you'd like to know more about any of the data that we have or any of the tools that we offer. And thank you very much.
Just a second, Michael. Does anyone have a quick question? Yeah.
What is the metric for
So the two different is chloropleth and geographic. What do we call that thing? Chloropleth versus geographic grid. That's what we call it. There's probably other names. Grid map.
Super.
That was easy.
Yeah. We put in a ringer, just to make sure you had an easy one. Alrighty, and then our final speaker today for this session is Aaron Milner. And he and I also share a similar, I think, curiosity about the world. So I work in U.S. Foreign Assistance now, and Aaron's going to talk a little bit from his perspective at CSIS about how people's lives have changed in the last, period in the world, because a lot of folks think that, there's development hasn't really progressed, and he's going to tell us a story about two divergent paths of how things have changed using data to kind of improve our understanding of how the world works. And Aaron, if you would come up and tell us about that.
Okay, thanks for having me today. Like Beth said, I'm gonna be everybody's favorite presenter because I pretty much just get to show you a video here. So that'll take 6 minutes of my time, and I don't have to, put words out of my mouth or anything. But like Beth said, this video is about the divergent paths of the developing world the past 20 years. Basically, the genesis, I'm going to go into the genesis more afterward, but the genesis of it was these misconceptions around what's going on in the developing world, where our money goes, what kind of progress has been made, and really dig into what countries have progressed, which haven't, and why. So I'm going to show a video that can kind of go into the motivation and the process behind the story here. You're going to see my boss talking, and then if you're a Hans Rosling fan, you're going to instantly know what's going on here.
We want to explore the divergent paths of the developing world and share one of the many stories that paint the modern picture of the global landscape. We'll demonstrate the interplay of good governance, rule of law, and economic growth. The x-axis shows rule of law for a country. Countries on the right have a stronger legal and societal structure. And here we have regulatory quality. The higher you go, the better government can promote a strong business environment. In summary, bottom left bad, top right good. The size of the bubble represents GNI per capita, with larger bubbles indicating higher average income for individual citizens. We looked at 36 countries across income levels, upper middle income in red, middle income in green, and low income in blue. These 4 countries, Bolivia, Haiti, Albania, and Georgia, show the diverging paths of the developing world. In 1996, Bolivia showed strong rule of law and a good business regulatory environment, but you can see that it had a comparable GNI to the other countries. Albania, Georgia, and Haiti performed below average on the indicators. Let's see what happens over the next 20 years in these 4 countries. Remember that Georgia was still newly independent from Soviet rule in 1996 and was struggling with the transition to democracy and a free market economy in its first few years. 2004 protests led to the resignation of Eduard Shevardnadze, who was president since 1995 in what became known as the Rose Revolution. After that, Georgia continued to implement free market reforms and transparent political expression under Mikhail Saakashvili. Despite occasional bumps, the Georgian economy has continued to grow. By 2015, Georgia outperforms China, Russia, Brazil, and many high-income countries in rule of law, business environment, and political voice. Albania is another former Soviet bloc country that has increased openness since 1995, contributing to stable growth. Their progress was tainted by accusations of corruption in their nascent multi-party and capitalist system. Albania's NATO membership in 2009 and its candidacy for EU accession in 2014 incentivized the country to reform and stay on the right path. On the other side is Bolivia. It performed relatively well in 1996 on the rule of law scale, and at least as well as South Africa with its business regulatory environment. After continual improvements until 2003 under President Goni Sanchez de Lozada, Bolivia descended into bad governance after the election of Evo Morales in 2005. Since then, Bolivia has regressed in part due to nationalistic interference in the economy and the judiciary. Over the 20-year period, Bolivia declined more than almost any country across regulatory, environment, and rule of law metrics. Its economic growth stagnated in comparison to other developing countries, especially Georgia. By 2015, Bolivia, once on a path to development and a rising middle-income country, is worse off than Honduras, Mali, and Pakistan by these metrics. Now let's finally turn to Haiti. It is an example of a country trapped by bad governance and weak rule of law that has enabled a cycle of poverty. The catastrophic 2010 earthquake destroyed infrastructure, sanitation, and health conditions. But Haiti had not demonstrated success even before the earthquake. Despite significant aid, Haiti has languished in underdevelopment. Here are the 4 divergent countries together. Countries like Georgia move from fragile to developed and stable, from aid to trade, in part thanks to improved laws, a better business environment, and a healthy multi-party democracy. Albania has succeeded in some regards, but it still has a ways to go. Countries like Bolivia took a different path and failed to deliver progress to its citizens. Haiti has not been able to escape poverty and underdevelopment. For the Georgias and Albanias of the world, we need new forms of cooperative relationships, moving from aid to trade, from development assistance to investment and partnership. For the Bolivias and Haitis of the world, we need to ask ourselves, what role can the U.S. and other partners play in returning them to a path of prosperity? Now it's up to us to do something about what we see. Welcome to the 2017 Global Development Forum.
So that was a video we put together for our Global Development Forum that we did in April across our team. I'm on 2 different global development teams, CSIS. We also have a lot of international security focus, but we are decidedly not a quantitative organization. We're a very qualitative institution. This is one of our first forays into kind of data analytics. It's not our last. We're going to have a forced migration project coming up where we're going to do a lot of mapping across the Middle East into Europe. But this was our first, and we learned a lot coming out of it. As you can see, it's a very kind of simple look. It was our first foray. We thankfully have probably the best creative team that it's called the iLab across any think tank in DC. I would bet my salary on that. So they helped us a lot in this, but it was my first time kind of being the quant guy, and I think my math and science teachers from when I was a kid would be mortified that I was up here talking to a bunch of data scientists and policy professionals about it. But I'm going to tell kind of my story, where this came from, what the genesis of this was, and this all really came out of last summer during the election. For a long time, foreign assistance has kind of been a scapegoat and been an enemy of domestic politics and politics in general of the country. It's been on this cross for a long time, and we don't blame anybody but ourselves. It's totally our fault for not being able to communicate what the positives in global development are, where the investments go, what the positives are for the U.S., and that's totally on us and the development industry in general. I know we have a lot of USAID and MCC people in the room. We're a very technocratic bunch, a lot of acronyms, a lot of jargon. I was even in a meeting recently where somebody referred to it as an AFZ, which is an acronym-free zone. So we had an acronym for no acronyms. And so that was my breaking point. So during the election, rather than being very despondent about it, we saw it as a referendum rejecting how we operated as a research institution. For a long time, we had a very direct, targeted audience just in the policymakers in Congress and the executive branch. But today, with the access to information and how easy it is to go online and learn about these things, we decided we needed to change our operations and really look at how we were putting out our research. Traditionally, that's in the form of 60-page reports. Nobody has time for that. I don't know if I've read any reports. I've written probably 12 of these things. I helped to write, commentaries, reports, but, this is the first time I've been on a stage like this, and I think that really speaks to the power of data, is that, you do one of these things in a unique way and really gets a lot of attention from kind of non-traditional groups that weren't always interested in global development. And so that was really our goal. We had our 2 main goals were to defend policy or defend development and really reinvigorate how our communications were done. So it was born out of these misconceptions, and then we didn't really know how to do it. Like we said, we've never done a data project before. Thankfully, we have the iLab. We have a few other teams in the building. Our international security project is probably the most adept team at this. They do a lot of defense budgetary analytics. If you're interested, it's called Defense 360 at CSIS, and they have a lot of visualizations based around R of looking at how much defense really costs and where some cuts can be made. But so, like I said, the genesis of this was kind of the misconceptions around foreign development, and we really do believe that there's a big need to update U.S. foreign development programs, but we didn't know how to communicate this. We didn't know how to communicate to the general public, and we realized we just really don't know how to tell stories. But finally, what came out of this, and I'll go one of my lessons learned later on is that we don't always need to tell a story. Going back to kind of what Michael said, is we don't need to tell one story. We can help people discover their own stories. And that's really our data for us coming out of this. Unfortunately, our tools, so we built this Gapminder. I spent the first 4 months of this year basically dragging data from 10 to 15 different collector institutions and centralizing it and making it more accessible. Unfortunately, Google no longer supports the tool that we created. Apparently, it was the most unpopular one, so bad selection on our part. But so we're trying to fix that right now, and then we're going to just put it out to the public that you can play around with 36 indicators across 34 countries for 20 years on 5 different axes. You know, I'm not a mathematician, but there's, you know, probably billions of combinations there of what you could create in your own story. We just wanted to drill down into those 4 little stories to try to show what's been going on in development over the past 20 years. I think we did that pretty successfully, but there's a long way to go in terms of data, and especially in development. It's hard to incentivize the collection of data, and that was probably my big challenge here. Is there are a lot of gaps. We chose those indicators because those were indices that didn't have gaps over the years. Those were indices that were created by the World Bank. So if you have trouble with what we're saying, just go talk to the World Bank. Don't talk to me. I can give you their phone number. But there are a lot of gaps in the indicators that we went through. We had 36 indicators, and there were some pretty cool ones in there. Initially, we had like the number of refrigerators per capita, the number of McDonald's per capita. One of the biggest ones we saw was the number of cell phones per capita. I think Rwanda jumped something like 100,000% over a few years. And speaking of Rwanda, that was actually the most impressive country in terms of some of these indicators. We didn't want to drill down into it because we didn't want to get bogged down in the Paul Kagame governance conversation. And that's another challenge that we had here. We had other countries like Venezuela or Turkey, but we didn't necessarily want to, you know, get focused on one country per se. So we purposely picked countries that people don't really focus on a ton. Georgia is kind of this development darling, especially for people at the MCC, but a lot of people probably in this country don't know that there's a country named Georgia. And so we wanted to kind of drill down into these smaller stories, but we also want to put the tool out there to let people really discover their own stories. So like I said, the sources, the World Bank, we used the World Health Organization, we used some ILO unemployment statistics, Freedom House, Transparency International, and that really made it a lot easier for us. Our job here was really just to centralize data. Like I said, I think the average person in America probably doesn't really care about foreign assistance. They don't need to care about foreign assistance for development. Our job is to convince them that they do. We weren't doing a good job of that. And so our easiest way was to centralize this data and to put it in this very collapsible, digestible format. So we learned I learned probably 3 or 4 rules about data coming out of this. The first was to let the data speak for itself. We wanted to create a narrative and a memo about all this before we even had the data, but then I started collecting it and I was surprised by some of the trends, like Rwanda, for example. I was very surprised. But we weren't able to put it all together until we had the Gapminder up. And so I spent probably January to March collecting the data, and then all of March just playing with various combinations. And we wanted to show something that had a lot of movement. If you notice, the size of the circle was GNI per capita. That really didn't change much over the whole time. And that's a very traditional development statistic. It's a very traditional economic indicator. But us seeing that it didn't change much, we were thinking maybe that's not the best indicator anymore. So we want to play around these other ones. And the rule of law, transparency, governance, those are ones that move the most. They're the easiest to see for the audience. So that's what we really wanted to present. So we had to let the data speak for itself. And that was hard for a lot of times, especially around the Venezuela and Rwanda things, because we knew that if we put out to a bunch of USAID professionals, a bunch of people who knew a lot about the world, that Rwanda performed the best of any country over the past 20 years, people were going to like burn our houses down. So the second rule was that our story was only as good as the data that goes into it. Thankfully, we are not a data collection agency. We don't know how to go on the ground into the developing world and incentivize data collection. What I found is a lot of these websites, a lot of these groups had the same data. It was all from the World Bank. So thankfully, we have a quality institution. There is already that quality institution that foreign assistance institutions can go to. The best stories for us came out of the discrepancies and the nuances and the surprising things. Georgia was a surprise. Albania was a surprise. That drop, or the the increase in Georgia, that explosion around 2004, that nuance, we had to go in and research the history there. So basically, we were giving a history lesson. And I think that's something that probably needs to really increase in quality in the U.S. The stories and the nuances of data, that's where the surprises came from. This is our first foray into data science. We're a qualitative institution, but what we've really discovered is we don't always have to tell one story. We don't have to put it in a 60-page report. And we can produce effective visualization. But what we're really looking forward toward in the future is how to improve this. And we're looking for new partners in this because global development is something that needs a lot of defense. It's something that is very important for the U.S., but it's something that's not easily communicatable. We wanted to come up with something that was very interpretable, very digestible, and very congestible. But I think we succeeded in that, but it obviously has a long way to go. I look forward to hearing how maybe you can help me in that. So thank you so much for your time.
Thank you. And yep, so I'd like to bring our panelists up, and we have until 11:40 for questions. So if you've got one, you've got 12 minutes to think about it, get in line behind a mic, practice and join these guys. And I will get us started. Thank you. I forgot my one job was to move it. So you guys just showed a ton of really interesting work on taking data or data questions, maybe is the better way to say it. Identifying a problem and then finding the data and making a tool of some sort for people to explore the data, and those people could be members of the public or decision makers or even people within the organization. I think probably we're all the same. We're all doing this also because we find this stuff fun, right? So we're probably also creating it for ourselves. I'm wondering if you could share or think about a time when you've had a data story that you did some of those steps along the way, or maybe you even made it all the way to the end and it totally bombed. And if you think about what's something that's what's like an indicator of those times when things are bombed, like what goes wrong?
So for me, what often goes wrong is it's usually in the data, first of all, and it's usually that it turns out there's some errors in the data, or the data just isn't accurate enough to tell the story that we're trying to tell. Maybe we made some assumptions about the data that weren't true, or we simply find bugs that maybe even the people who originally assembled the data didn't realize were there. But there's a lot of pitfalls when you're working with data. So it's definitely important. One of the most important things to do, other than in the cleaning and analysis phase, is to figure out strategies for verification and checking, and figure out ways you can catch those errors. And then on the other side, when you have data to share with someone who's doing the storytelling, it's very important to fully discuss all the limitations of the data. Sometimes a field in your data set might, you may know that, yes, this has an error of like 20%, so don't try to like aggregate that column. That's definitely important, because sometimes that may lead to someone drawing inaccurate conclusions from the data set. So yeah, discussing those limitations up front is very important.
This was our first try, so we haven't failed yet. No, but I mean, we're done forever. But no, I think our failure came, a long time before this. I mean, we just never been able to tell a data story, and I think that's been our big challenge. I think there's probably been some bias in who we're talking to for a long time. We need to stop talking to ourselves and realize what our perceptions are outside of DC. And then, you know, that will dictate what our data should be, what we should care about, and how we should convince other people to care about it.
Yeah, along limitations, we developed a tool once that was meant just to be an exploratory tool to help some of our agencies start to think about problems that they might be facing on the roadways. And I guess we didn't communicate that very well, because all of a sudden, one of the major state DOTs we work for put out this huge press release and spent thousands and thousands of dollars printing out these giant booklets that were essentially statistical reports that just had screenshots of all of our tools in them. And, you know, we hadn't really validated every single thing that was in those tools, but someone had taken it as, you know, the God's honest truth, and there can be nothing wrong with our tools. And that was scary.
Right. Can we talk a little bit more about those kind of validation and bias and how you communicate the background data when you're producing these tools that allow people to do neat things with the data set? Yeah, can you talk a little bit more about any techniques you use to make sure that you're being truthful? I think as a scientist, sometimes we don't use those. You know, back in, it's been a long time since I've been in the lab, but back in the lab, you're doing this too, right? You get a data set and you go show your PI something, and you haven't run the statistics on it. So you know, you're picking countries that you said you give us the spiel about how you decided, and there were some quantitative reasons and qualitative reasons. If you could talk a little bit about trying to build in protections against bias in your.
Yeah, I think our biggest thing was that we didn't want to infer causality here. We were worried that a lot of people would say, like, oh, if you put in just a very liberalized political system or economic order, that your country will start succeeding and, you know, you'll be on this upward trajectory. That's not what we're trying to say at all. And what we're really trying to say is, you know, there's a lot of stuff going on here. It's very complicated to show in like a 5-minute video. And usually when you have like a data analytical project like this, you have a very clear targeted audience and a very clear communication loop of people who are usually understanding what you're trying to show. Here, we just put this video out there. We had a very disconnected communication loop, and that was our big worry, is we put this out there and a lot of people would kind of misunderstand what we were going toward.
So we're the Washington Post, and we're always going to be accused of being biased. So we're used to that, but we do try to be fair. I think when you're doing storytelling and when you make a chart, you kind of are taking a position. It's impossible to make a perfectly unbiased chart, I actually think. But we can try to be fair, and we definitely want to make sure that people don't draw inaccurate conclusions from those charts. So we do think about that, and we also, when it's appropriate, try to release the data. So for our police shootings project, we publish the data behind our conclusions there. It's updated on GitHub every day, so then people can download that and do their own analysis on it.
So we've been accused of bias in the fact that some of our data sets are, you know, if we're tracking people that have smartphones using navigation systems, our data is going to be reflective of the class of people that have smartphones. So that might be missing out on transit and other underrepresented populations. There's not a whole lot we can do about that other than try to merge the markets to provide better data for those groups. But, you know, we have little control over than telling our folks where the data came from and trying to make it available. I had this one experience with a collision data set that we had published, and we produced some heat maps of where collisions were occurring in a particular state. And it was very obvious that the most dangerous spots in the state were at intersections, which is where all the collisions were happening. And, you know, that makes sense, right? And our heat maps were beautiful, and everyone loved them. We found out a year or two later that the agency that reported this data did their system just made you select an intersection. So, you know, it was a roadie intersection, even though it could have been a mile or two away from that intersection. Like, well, crap. And the work was good, but the stuff behind it was not. And, yeah.
So I'm going to make a comment, but if anybody has, I saw someone was standing up before and had a question, so if people could go to the mics with their questions, I'd love to take a couple before we stop. And yeah, I was going to say this question of when you're looking in the weeds, sometimes you're just straight up looking only at the weeds. Okay, so I will take one question from each side, I think, and then I'd answer them both at the same time.
Hello, my name is Hamza Mustay. I'm from the Program Management and Budget. Thank you all for joining us today. My question was, all of your data seems to have policy implications and focus on not investment causality, but I was wondering if the views are on, like, if they are on that, but since, you know, might be got into policy investment, and where do you feel like it's appropriate to work back for the policy process, and if your work has ever been used for that purpose.
Great, then we'll take one.
Hi, I'm Beth Russell. I'm a consultant for data project. And my question kind of gets at what I saw from all of your talks is there's this concept that either the data itself is longitudinal, and you may go back to data again and you can look at it again. And that's a concept when we think about how we use data overall, that's interesting to me because most of the time when we do an experiment, we do a project, we do it, we put it on the shelf, and then we almost never go back. But there's a huge value in longitudinal data and then going back to the data. So can you make some comment on how you think we should reposition or not reposition ourselves as a society to look at how we make it better more generally, how we spend our time on it?
So I'm just going to reiterate that so that it has them in our minds. These data have real policy implications, as most data do. How do you kind of participate in that process as part of your work? And then also, given this longitudinal data, how can we continue to use it over time and work that into our processes?
With respect to continuing to use the data over time, a lot of agencies that we've worked with have data retention policies. They keep it for 2 years, 3 years, whatever, and then they archive it someplace else or just get rid of it. And with data storage technologies today and the price of storage going down, we have an indefinite retention policy, and I think most agencies should have that. Whereas once we get data from someone, we always make it publicly available, always available through some of our tools, some way, somehow. Discovering that data can still be a challenge, but not having these data retention policies that put things on tape decks in some library someplace is important.
I'll go for the policy question first. My boss always says our main job is to just prevent bad things from happening. In DC, that's a full-time job, maybe more. But we are inherently a policy analysis institution. This tool we want to create because we saw a lot of antipathy or a lot of negative energy directed towards foreign assistance, and we thought that we should probably go after that. We talk a lot to policymakers. We go up to the Hill all the time. There's actually a lot of support out there for global development, and when you really sit down with somebody, it's pretty easy to convince them that investments in global development are a good thing. The hard thing is putting that message out there in general. So this tool wasn't directed toward any kind of policymaking institution. If anything, we wanted to support our friends at USAID and everything like that, but this tool we probably wouldn't use going to show a congressman or, you know, somebody at state or, you know, a budget justification office. But yeah, I mean, usually we use like the 60-page reports for that kind of thing.
So for the policy implications, our work definitely has led to some. I can't point to anything specific with the power plants. That's more commentary on how policy has changed. But for our police shootings database, for instance, that and the
work of nonprofits and Guardian as well did lead to some efforts on the part of the federal government to improve their data collection process for police shootings. I'm not optimistic under this administration that that will continue, but we are continuing to collect the data and continuing to write about it. And we just did a piece at the beginning of July looking at the first half of this year and looking at how the rate is actually the rate of fatal police shootings is actually remarkably steady over time. So that does that mean we've had an impact or not? I don't know. I think we have had an impact on the conversation and some impact on policy, but that is something to think about.
All right, thanks everybody for those questions, and I have a whole list of interesting things that we could talk about another time. And I just wanted to thank the panel, and then I'm going to introduce our next speaker.
My speaker is Leah Shanley. She's the co-executive director of the South Bay Data Hub. She's running a community of data scientists, data users, data interested people who maybe don't even know that they're interested in data but want to solve problems. And she's working with folks in government and academia and the private sector. These hubs exist in 40 of the country, and she's responsible for the South Bay Data Hub, and she's also one of the Well, thank you all. And I know I'm standing between you all and lunch, so I will try to be fast here. Just to make you aware, we're one of the co-sponsors of this event. I was a AAAS Congressional Science Fellow in 2008-2009. Meredith Lee, who's the Executive Director of the West Hub, was also the AAAS Fellow at DHS. So I thought it was quite natural and very exciting for us to be able to collaborate with AAAS and the Big Data Affinity group for the fellows. So I thank all of our partners in this, as well as datascience.com. Dave wasn't able to join us here today, but he's also played a big role. And I also want to thank Sarah Davis, she's in the room. She's one of our South Bay Data Hub project managers, and she's done the heavy lift in handling the business. So as Beth mentioned, the Big Data Hub is a network of 4 hubs. It was launched by the National Science Foundation in 2015, although we are co-sponsored by our host institutions, I'm at North Carolina Chapel Hill. West Hub is at UC Berkeley and UCSD and University of Washington are also collaborators on the West Hub. We focus on building and strengthening public-private partnerships, working across sectors, academia, government, private sector, to apply data science and analytics to real-world challenges, the things that are important in our region, as well as national challenges, hopefully spurring economic development and fostering national big data. In addition to the hubs, the National Science Foundation funds about $11 million a year in what they call spoke grants. There are about 4 or 5 projects per hub. In the South, we have one on smart grid, one on bioinformatics, so connecting wearable data, electronic health data, social media data, another one looking at use of machine learning, natural language processing, and IBM Watson, who look at encyclopedic life data, include interpretation and use of that. In the West Hub, they have a great, book on police data. There's one on smart city transportation. So we really run the gamut of topic areas in the application of data science. There's an open solicitation right now, so if you're interested in learning more, one of the collaborative partnerships that the Hub put together, led by Meredith Lee, the West Hub, is the National Transportation Data Challenge. We're doing that in cooperation with Dan Morgan, the U.S. Department of Transportation Chief Officer, the National Science Foundation, cloud providers including Microsoft, Google, and Amazon, and many others. There's events around the country. There was a launch event in Seattle. We'll have the finale at the end of the term in the fall here in Washington, D.C. But go to bigdatahub.io to learn more and how you can participate. We're also building partnerships to help our hub members, and you can become a hub member for free just by signing up for a listserv. And that includes a grant program, competitive grant program for Microsoft Azure credit. So the Microsoft is providing $3 million in credit plus 150 hours of technical support for hubs, plus free training for those who have agency projects. Now, this isn't just the $10,000 to $20,000 level. For the hubs, this is $70,000 to $100,000 award in credit. So these are big data projects. We're working to grow networks, communities of practice, focus on the application of data science tools to specific team areas like manufacturing, security, smart cities, hoping to bridge the gap between research and practice, share data, tools, resources. And the other thing we're focusing on in this workshop as part of this is building data science capacity through education, training, workforce development. So we're very excited to have you guys here today. I'm very excited to have you fellow training. A couple of other things, for example, in the South Hub is we're connecting bright graduate students to the entrepreneurial community for summer internships, and we've got one package. That's my contact information. Here's Meredith's contact information slides we made available. And the West Hub is just rocking. It's a very exciting workshop. They're the one that launched the data science series, providing a science data-driven storytelling. They had 700 participants online. That webcast can be provided on the West Big Data Hub YouTube channel. So I encourage you to look at that as well. This event will be posted on the South Big Data Hub YouTube channel. And then we have a Slack account for those of you who want to join the Hub discussion long term, and we encourage you to participate in that. With that, I'll pass it on to Joanna.
So, thank you, Leah. Before we head out to lunch, let me talk about the logistics of the afternoon. There will be 2 workshops at 1 o'clock. The Tableau workshop will be back here at the auditorium. And then the D3 workshop by John will be in the Abelson room, and you should see signs outside the rooms. And during lunch, we also have an optional discussion led by 2 of my fellows, Chichi and Barbara. They are going to talk about design thinking. And if you want to do some networking, please join us at the Revere Road. And we may have a tight space for lunch, and there are tables in the 2 breakout rooms and also sit around area. There's also a room 207 all the way on the other side of the hallway, which is also available for us during lunch. So feel free to use any space except the auditorium for lunch, and enjoy your lunch, and see you back here for the afternoon session. Thank you. Hello. So we are getting ready for our afternoon session, and so grab a seat. And this afternoon we will start with a discussion from Shannon, who is also our sponsor for this event. So thank you very much for his support, and then please welcome Shannon.
Thank you, Joanna. Actually, I'm here representing the National Consortium for Data Science, which is a membership-driven group based out of the University of North Carolina, Chapel Hill. We're actually a sister organization to the South Big Data Hub that Leah talked about earlier. And we agreed, our members agreed to sponsor lunch. So if you like lunch, thanks to due to us or the members. And in return for lunch, I requested a few minutes on the agenda because data visualization or data storytelling is an important subject to our members and to me. I'm not working with the National Consortium for Data Science. I actually teach at the business school at the University of North Carolina, Chapel Hill, and one of the topics I teach is data analytics, and visualization is one thing we spend a lot of time talking about. To answer the question that posed, can data storytelling be taught? I hope so, because that's what I do, but we all tell stories. We've all learned how to tell stories, so by definition, it can be taught. I think what makes it challenging from a perspective of teaching is that because we all tell stories, it's part of the human condition. We all think we're really good at it, and some of us are good and some are not good. And so the challenge in the classroom is helping students figure out what it is to tell a great story, particularly when there's a lot of data behind it or it's data-driven. Perhaps one of my favorite stories is about how fast or how quickly things are changing. You probably all read about or see different stories or visuals about how fast things are changing. This one graphic from Time magazine talks at the top about the accelerating rate of change. It talks about there being 8,000 years between the agricultural revolution and the industrial revolution, 120 years to the light bulb, 90 years to the moon landing, 22 years to the World Wide Web, and then 9 years to sequencing the human genome. This chart said a lot of that's due to the exponential growth in computing power. This is a logarithmic scale, and it talks about all the things that have happened, and it predicts the singularity will happen at some point in time. Now that's an interesting story. There's a lot of data there. The way I like to tell the story is more of a visual. This is my grandfather, who was born in 1914, and he got married in 1938. And the woman he married, my grandmother, before they got married, she was living at home with her widowed father. And so the arrangement was, when they got married, they'd move into the house that she had grown up in, which is in this photo. So my grandfather's wedding gift to my grandmother was to wire the house for electricity. So you can imagine the courting situation where they could communicate with her. When he visited, if it was nightfall, it had the candles, no radio, no TV. It was a pretty quiet situation. And when he died in 2011, he had a cell phone and was on a computer. So to think about what he saw in his lifetime, from a house with no electricity to cell phones and computers, to me is an amazing story. What's even more amazing is everything that I read, everything that I've heard, is that my children will see a greater rate of change in their lifetime than he saw in his lifetime. So it's amazing to think what would happen in their lifetime, and they're 23 and 21. And so hopefully I'll be around for a while to see that and observe that. The challenge I think we all face in telling stories with data is that no one reads anymore. In my experience, everybody is looking at pictures or listening to podcasts. Even Twitter itself, although it's a text-based platform, there's also some information that says the tweets that get reacted to are the ones with pictures. So how do you communicate a story when people aren't looking at pictures anymore? And I think what happens in this, with all the technologies available, is we get too enamored or too caught up in the data, and we forget the story. So one of the things that we talk about in our class is how do you go about remembering the story and not getting lost or getting too in love with the data. I hate infographics. Right. In my opinion, it's, no offense to anyone, there are some that are done well, but in my experience, it's a lazy way to try to capture as much information as possible. So it's hard to find the story in infographics. There are all sorts of other problems about data that don't line up, but are included in the infographics. Sourcing, you can't see it on the slide, but at the very bottom right is a list of all the sources that went into this data. Now, if you wanted to go find a specific point in data, good luck trying to map that data point back to the particular source that it comes from. So I don't think pictures are the answer. I think pictures are a way to enable the story, but at its core, you have to remember what the story is about. You may have seen this graphic. It's somewhat iconic in the literature around data visualization. Some people say that this is what drove the Army away from PowerPoint. Apparently, it was used in a presentation to General McChrystal when he was in Afghanistan, and when he saw it, he just put the kibosh on PowerPoint for the Army. Because it's really hard to understand what's going on here, what the information is trying to communicate. Now, in all defense to, no pun intended, defense to the people that prepared this slide, it was probably part of a longer presentation. There probably was a story there that built up to this, but this alone is just a horrendous chart. There's no way to figure out what's going to come from here. So in my opinion, what you have to do, you have to think about storytelling and remember that there are three ways to use data in visualization. There's data exploration, which we spent a lot of time talking about in this Tableau session. Thank you for that. The folks from Tableau, I think that was a great session. The data presentation, there's a lot of the other presentations that I've seen today were about how to present data. But then the storytelling is all about the story. And what you can't forget is what is the message you're trying to get across. There's an apocryphal story about Ernest Hemingway and a bet he had with his colleagues that he could tell a story in 6 words. Is anybody familiar with that story? And so he allegedly won the bet with this story. 6 words, for sale, baby shoes, never worn. And there's memes on the internet now. We can find out all sorts of information about 6-word stories, 6-word biographies, and they're not all necessarily quite as poignant as this one. Some of them can be a little more fun, a little more humorous. But in each case, they can have puns in them too. And in each case, there's a story there. And in my view, those 6 words in each of those 2 examples do a much better job of telling a story than the graph on the left. And so the message that we communicate to the students is that it's the message first and pictures and data follow. And it's an iterative process. You can't get in love with the story or in love with the data. You got to pull them together to figure out what the message is. And I think it's getting even harder in this day and age with fake news and ways to manipulate graphics, a way to manipulate pictures and visuals. This is a picture you may have seen recently from the G20. It's an AP photo, and this is from Gizmodo, which was someone had taken, this GIF is Gizmodo, so someone had taken a still shot of Putin sitting in the chair and spread that around the internet, so it looks like Putin's at the center of the leader from Turkey, France, that's Angela Merkel back at the President of the United States. So it's really important to think about the message, and I'm going to talk in a minute about some key checklists that we ask our students to go through when they're doing the presentations, and credibility and truth is one of them. So characteristics of well-told stories. If you've read the Checklist Manifesto by Atul Gawande, it's all about in the healthcare setting in surgical suites, they started using checklists, which seemed like it was rote and it wasn't necessary, and doctors didn't want to do it, but they saw mortality and mistakes drop considerably when they started using checklists. So what we tell our students is make sure the message is simple. No distractions, not a lot of stuff in the background. One of the things that we observe when the students create a visual is they're in love with it, and they hate to leave things out, take things off. But if it doesn't tell a story, it should not be in it. Put it in the appendix if you need to. It needs to be informative. You need to reveal something to the audience. The audience doesn't come away from your presentation, your article, your tweet without having learned something. It's probably not a very effective tweet, or you're talking to the wrong audience. And that goes back to knowing the audience. You want to know who they are and what their interests might be. So an audience of scientists like I'm talking to now would be very different than an audience of students that I might talk to tomorrow. Did I miss one? So credible, those be truth, and that they're going to believe, and depending on the audience, it may take more emphasis, more effort to convince them that what you're saying is credible. It needs to be actionable. Provide a next step for them. A lot of my background is in sales, and whether you believe it or not, you're always selling. You're selling. You're selling yourself, you're selling an idea, you're selling a product. So make sure that the story, the visual you're using, is going to get them to take an action, or at least convince them of the point you're trying to make. It needs to be relatable. You know, if you can make it personal, like my grandfather, personal to me, it may make it more impactful for you. Somehow I can relate to you in the audience, that's going to be of interest to you. It needs to be familiar. You understand the audience. Again, if you're talking to scientists, you may not have to go into some details around regression and how the data has been created. If it's a more general public audience, then you need to understand what they're going to know. I like the acronym-free zone that someone talked about earlier. That's something to think about depending on who the audience is. If it's emotional, if you can talk about some strings or make it interesting, that always helps to make it relatable. And concrete, sometimes with numbers, that's very important because sometimes humans don't appreciate the scale of numbers, and a lot of people think the difference between 1,000 and a million is almost the same as a million to a billion, and we all know there's a huge difference in that logarithmic scale. Contextual, when you put it in the context of them, where it's coming from. I like the question that was asked earlier about the graphic around power plants in the United States, and someone wanted to know how's it changed over time. That's what the audience wants to know. A point in time is not nearly as impactful as how things have changed over time or under different conditions. And finally, sequential. To me, a story needs to be sequential. one of the things that we drive into our students is situation, complication, resolution. And if you don't know where to start with those three words. What's the situation, what's the complication, and what's the resolution? My daughter is studying to be, she's majoring in creative writing. What she's going to do with that, I have no idea, but she wants to, so that's fine. And so I was talking to her about this, and she said, no, that it's not situation, complication, resolution. It's settings, heroes, obstacles, rewards. Same idea, but different context, fiction versus nonfiction. So that's the message from NCDF, from the National Consortium for Data Science. Here are our members. We're proud to be partnering with the Self Big Data Hub, and we're excited that we're here and taking part in this conversation. Now, when she comes to set up her computer, it's my job to introduce Christy Steele, who is a media producer, and she has done a variety of productions in her career across all different types of media, from print to television to radio, and probably other things I'm not aware of. But as Christy sets up, I'll take some questions, but when she's set up, she'll be ready to go. Sarah, where do you want this? Any questions? You know, the Washington Post example earlier, and the New York Times, they do a really good job from a media standpoint. They're pretty, sometimes they're a little messy, but I think they're good. There's a website called Flowing Data, if you've seen it. They do a pretty good job of thinking about how to tell, or present data. Sometimes they err on the side of presentation versus storytelling, but they're aware of that. We good? All right. Welcome, Christy.
Okay, I think we're all set. There were many steps to make sure that everybody could hear and that the videos will play. So thank you very much for the introduction. Thank you for having me here to speak to you guys today. I know it's been a bit of a long day, so I appreciate you guys hanging in there. I'm here to talk about storytelling, and I'm really excited to do that. I have experience trying to tell powerful stories, and often in my career so far, these have been stories about science. And I've been really blessed to work with some talented artists and creators, as well as a lot of brilliant scientists and experts in many different fields. I was working at Science last year for about a year and a half, so I worked with Alberto, who you guys heard from earlier today. I've also worked at National Geographic magazine and in television and film production on shows for Smithsonian and Animal Planet and Travel Channel. And I'm always seeking out new ways to learn about stories, about science, and about all the amazing technologies that we have available to us. So I wanted to start my presentation today with the question, why do we need stories? Obviously, there's so much data, there's so much information, and why can't the data and the numbers be enough to get people to do what we want, to tell them our stories, to share our information? And sometimes it can, sometimes the data is enough. But often the data and the numbers and the facts, they need a story to give them context. They need some additional meaning. And stories allow our audience, whether it's our peers, an organization, a politician, a community, the stories allow the audience to connect to that information in a deeper way, in a meaningful way. A professor at the Washington Jefferson University said, humans simply aren't moved to action by data dumps, dense PowerPoint slides, or spreadsheets packed with figures. People are moved by emotion. The best way to emotionally connect other people to our agenda begins with once upon a time. So we have the opportunity, when we have this data, when we have these numbers, and we have the opportunity to create a narrative from that and to turn that into a story and shape the meaning. And we've been doing this as humans for 30,000 years. We've been telling stories, and it's one of our most fundamental communication methods. It's how we communicate with each other as humans. There is a researcher at the Laboratory of Language Dynamics in France, and she did a study, Véronique Boulanger. She did a 2009 study showing that when individuals read phrases like these, John grasped the object, or Pablo kicked the ball, that their brain scans revealed activity in the motor cortex, which coordinates the body's movements, which indicates that we actually don't make a huge distinction between doing an action ourselves and reading about someone doing it. So when we tell a story, we're kind of creating a physical, emotional, mental experience for our viewer. We can actually physically affect our viewer. So it's we're in a really powerful position when we tell stories. What are stories? At their core, stories are causes and effects linked together. So we're telling people this happened and then this happened. This is what we learn from the time we're born. When we do things, other people do things in response. And as we grow, we learn, what actions we want to elicit from other people. Stories also usually take the viewer on a journey. So we start somewhere and we usually end somewhere different. We've taught the audience something they didn't know before. Hopefully they're connecting on a deeper level to what it means for them to be a human. And some stories follow a 5-act structure or some part of it. So we start with exposition, give the background, some context, we introduce our characters, our key players. There's some rising action that leads to a climax, and it's the exciting part of the story. The falling action is, resolving the conflicts from the story, and then we get to a final resolution, or what has been called a denouement. What are the elements of a powerful story? So how do we transform our data and our numbers and our studies into engaging and awe-inspiring stories? So I'd like to go through some examples of work that I've done, and also other work I've seen that I've not been involved in, but that has been really inspiring to me. And I'm going to go through 6 elements that I think that I've seen in many powerful stories. And the first one is eliciting emotion. This is the December 4th cover of Science magazine, and I worked on this as a photo editor at Science. The special issue was about aging, and it included news articles about aging in pets, about attempts to measure biological age, as well as research papers on stem cells, healthy aging, and mitochondrial dysfunction. So the range of topics was very broad. Our team decided to put an image on the cover that would help the reader connect to this wide-reaching subject matter by hopefully connecting them emotionally. I set up a photo shoot. We had a man who was in his 80s, and then we had a baby who was about 1 year old, and the photographer captured a lot of beautiful photos, and the team chose this one to be on the cover. And hopefully anyone who sees this connects to it in some emotional way, whether it's seeing the amazing way that our skin ages as we get older, or the powerful connection between generations. This is one of my favorite covers that I worked on at Science. We had to find a photo to illustrate a paper about early vocal development in primates. I just absolutely love this photo of this baby marmoset because he is screaming out with such determination. And I connect to it personally, and I feel that I understand that feeling of trying to be heard and trying to communicate with people and wanting them to hear you. And I just love this photo. The next element I want to talk about is creating suspense. So when I think of suspense, I think of a Hollywood film, someone dangling off a cliff or a bank robber about to be captured. But we can definitely create suspense in our scientific stories just by the way that we present them. This is a photograph from the 2016 Nikon Small World Photo Micrography competition. It's the front foot of a male diving beetle, and it's at 100 times magnification. By using tools like this type of photography, we can create intrigue and suspense, because when people see this image, they don't know what they're looking at. They want to dig in more, they want to read more, and they want to know how did you create this amazing photo. This is another cover that I worked on at Science magazine. Again, we had a special section about forensics, and it covered many topics in the field of forensics, from blood spatters to the criminal uses of Bitcoin. We had to figure out a good way to illustrate all of these stories in one cover, and we chose to use bullets. I traveled to the National Institute of Standards and Technology with a photographer, and we spent the day with the experts there, playing with these bullets that had been test fired from guns to examine the striation marks. We captured this photo and ended up running it, and it kind of plays on a lineup of criminals and draws the reader into the issue, and they want to learn more about these bullets. Another way of creating suspense is to invite the audience to join you on your journey as you're discovering, as you're learning, as you're carrying out your experiment, so capturing video as you're going. This is a show that I worked on at Smithsonian Channel. It's called Islands of Creation, and it covers the research of Dr. Al Uwe. He works in the Solomon Islands, and he's attempting to catch speciation in action. So when I first heard that, the concept to me was a little bit difficult to grasp, but I'm going to play you a clip of Dr. Uwe doing his research on the black-bellied and brown-bellied monarch flycatchers, and you can get a sense of what his research really looks like.
Collected by Meyer and Jared Diamond led him to the perfect test case, the black monarch flycatchers of small Santa Ana Island, just 4 miles from the brown-bellied flycatchers on the large island of Makira.
It is very surprising to us that they are that different. And so we focus on that group because we want to study a population where they're close enough where they might actually come into contact with each other.
Were the color differences between these birds a sign that speciation was progress? To answer that question, we need to determine whether monarchs recognize other birds with the same color as members of their own species. Like many songbirds, monarch males and females fiercely defend their territories in the forest. Intruders that have the same appearance are potentially competitors, both for food and for mates.
So imagine a situation when you're sleeping quietly at night, things are great, and you hear a noise downstairs. Well, what do? If you were an alpha macho male, clearly what you would do is grab a baseball bat and check out what's going on downstairs. And if it turns out to be an intruder, you will attack. What we've done is an intruder coming into your house or your territory.
We found monarch territories and presented the resident birds with a taxidermic mouth, a replica, either of a bird from the same population or from another population.
And to make the bird feel more realistic, we would also have to play the song that accompanies the physical appearance of the bird so that the living bird would think that the dead bird, the taxidermy bird, is actually alive. What we found is that they really attack the mounts of birds that look like them. So for chestnut birds, they attack chestnut mounts. For blackbirds, they attack black mounts to the point where they would try to tear up and pull the feathers and knock the taxidermy mounts down to the ground.
In the birds' furious battles with their simulated foes, Uwe sees a telling pattern.
Yes, color is important. Regardless of how you interpret it, color is affecting the way they interact, and then they're using it to recognize members of their own species. The next inference is that this is a mate choice issue, a competition for mates issue.
The flycatchers don't seem to recognize differently colored birds as members of their own species. They're much more likely to attack birds that look like themselves.
So in the clip that we just watched, we get transported to the Solomon Islands. We get to see the birds that he's talking about. For me, when I got to watch the final product after working on this so long, it was so vivid and so visual. The next element I want to talk about is taking the viewer on a journey, which was definitely represented in Dr. Uwe's research. We can use our stories to transport viewers to a different time, to a different place, and show them something that they will never see with their naked eye. This is a clip from Monsters Inside Me, which is a show that I worked on for Animal Planet. I helped to write graphic scripts about bacteria and parasites that enter the human body, and we described what they do once they get in your body. This is a 1-minute animation I'll show you of toxoplasma when it gets in the human body, what it does.
That once it's inside the body, it's almost impossible to destroy. When the toxoplasma parasite gets attacked by the immune system or by drugs, it forms a cyst that is almost indestructible. The immune system can keep this parasite at bay, but it can't kill it. Once a human gets the toxoplasma parasite, they will have it for the rest of their life.
The parasite travels through the human body in the blood. When it reaches the tissues, it bursts out and attacks the surrounding cells. When the body's white blood cells attack the parasite, the surrounding tissues become inflamed. If the parasite gets into the eye, this inflammatory response damages the retina, causing blindness.
It's quite startling, to me at least. I can read all I want about how parasites work in your body, what they do, what bacteria does, but when I see that, I am very drawn in. The fourth element I want to talk about is sharing your enthusiasm. Oh, that didn't work. I'm sorry. I'm just having some trouble here. Sharing your enthusiasm. If you as a researcher or a scientist or the expert are really excited and passionate about your information that you want to share and you have a story to tell, that's going to come through. The goal is to portray your passion about the information because passion is contagious. Trevor Frost is a very talented National Geographic photographer. I've been lucky enough to work with him on a few different projects. And I want to share a clip of a project he's been working on. I'm not involved in this one, but I think it's amazing. He has been exploring a story about crocodiles in Australia. About 50 years ago, saltwater crocodiles were almost extinct in Australia. Today, they're back to high population numbers. And Trevor's been to Australia a few times to capture photos and footage to tell this unique conservation story that's led to their comeback.
We are in Darwin, capital of the Northern Territory, and we are on a mission to try and document crocodiles in a different way. We got the idea that if I came back with a bunch of remote control boats, I could load them up with cameras and get video of crocodiles' jaws closing around the camera, which would be the first time that's ever been done. If he holds on to it and he swims around with it, we could actually learn a little bit about what crocodiles are doing with their prey once they catch it. Maybe we'll learn something new about crocodiles. That's at least hope. I have no idea if I'm going to get the cameras back or not. It looks a little bit like a spaceship. I'm serious.
Let's skip forward just a second here. In the interest of time, I want to show you what he captured on camera, which is incredible. Trevor is very brave, as is his girlfriend who travels with him and films what he's doing.
Oh yeah, there he goes.
Oh yeah, Trevor. That's what's going on.
Because of Trevor's bravery, as some of us might call it, he captured this incredible footage. This is the first time anyone has ever seen crocodile jaws closing on a camera. We get to see Trevor in action. We get to see him in the field. We get to join him in his creative process, which crocodiles are to me, pretty fascinating anyways, but when we watch Trevor there, it turns it into a whole new story. The National Ecological Observatory Network is a very ambitious continental scale of conservation project. There are facilities around the country that are gathering climate and ecosystem data in an attempt to measure environmental change. As a photo editor at Science, I worked on this story, and I went with a photographer and a videographer to a site in Front Royal, Virginia, to capture photos and footage of the site itself. I'm going to just show you the website just to mention that it's really important to think about what tools you have at your disposal. For this project, we ended up using a time-lapse clip as the intro, of course the text, and a couple of sidebars to explain the story. Actually, Alberto Quadra's team created this interactive graphic where you can see all of the different sites around the US. I edited together a video from the footage that we captured, and we got to interview key people involved in the project. They created another illustration to show what each of the sites looks like, and we added a photo at the end. It's really important to keep in mind when you're creating your stories, which elements are best going to serve my story. Do I need text? Do I need photos? Do I need graphics, illustrations, animations, video? The list is endless, and you want to think about that every time that you're creating a story. This element, connecting to something bigger, people want to connect to a sense of something larger than themselves. And Science has the power to do that. Data Stories is a competition here at Science Magazine. I was part of the team that created the first annual competition. It invites scientists from around the world in any field to submit a 90-second or less video story based on a data set or multiple data sets. The submissions are judged on complexity, creativity, and clarity. I definitely encourage you to go to this website and watch some of them. I'm going to share a data story that wasn't submitted to that competition, but it's in the same vein. So this is, I can see a spreadsheet, so many numbers, overwhelming to me at least. And the American Museum of Natural History created a really cool visualization out of this. I wasn't involved in this project, but I'm amazed by the way they turned these numbers into a story. And it's called Human Population Through Time. We need audio for this one. As you can see, they've created a world map. They've added a timeline at the bottom here. And as we move along the timeline, they're throwing up world events so we can get a sense of the things that were going on at this time. And we're seeing the human population actually pop up on this map. It's so visual, it's so impactful, and it took a lot of data, a lot of numbers to go into this. And it has a lot of elements. It ends up feeling quite simple because it's very easy to comprehend and understand, and it's effective at portraying this incredible sense of population growth. The last element I want to talk about is based on a quote by Andrew Stanton, who helped to create Toy Story, Finding Nemo, and a couple of other big movies you've probably heard of. He said, "Set out to evoke wonder. It's the secret sauce. People want to be wowed. They want to be reminded of the incredible possibility that exists." To illustrate this element, I'm going to tell you one last story, and it's about the human heart. A scientist named Dr. Kevin Parker runs a Harvard University lab, and he hopes to one day build a human heart. I want to start with this slide because this is what we started with when I was at Science and we were working on this story. We got the research paper. We all read this research paper, Phototactic Guidance of a Tissue-Engineered Soft Robotic Ray. As the photo editor, I read the paper and we were deciding whether to feature this on the cover. And from reading the paper, I learned that Dr. Parker had engineered an artificial stingray. It was about the size of a nickel. The stingray was made from a multi-pronged gold skeleton that was sandwiched between two silicone layers. It contained 200,000 living heart cells from a 2-day-old rat embryo, and to top it all off, it actually moved in response to flashing light. It was incredible. It sounded amazing. And while it sounded so amazing, once I talked to Dr. Parker, I was even further drawn into his research. I learned that he was an Army veteran and that he regularly has veterans into his lab at Harvard and discusses with them ways to better treat injured veterans. When a close friend of his was wounded with a traumatic brain injury in Afghanistan, he actually began focusing a lot of research on traumatic brain injury. Since then, he's continued to push the envelope in his research in hopes of creating technology that will serve to better protect the human body and also rebuild it when it gets damaged. He told me about 2 really important trips that he made with his young daughter, to the Boston Aquarium. The first time he saw a jellyfish, and the rhythmic pumping reminded him of the pumping of a heart, and he started to make connections in his mind. And he built a simple artificial creature composed of heart muscle cells that contracted in response to electricity. The second time he went to the aquarium, his daughter tried to reach in one of the stingray tanks to pet the stingray, and it immediately zoomed off in the opposite direction. It changed directions really quickly. And he started to think again about this muscle movement and the heart, the human heart. After learning about the research, I traveled with a photographer to his lab in Boston. We completely darkened the room, and the photographer went to work. He tried to capture, this is supposed to be a video, but it's not running. He tried to capture the actual moving stingray, and he got some really stunning photos, and one that ended up on the cover of the July 8th issue of Science. The team at Science also, for this one, created a multifaceted presentation of the story. So it included photos, it included a video with animation to explain science, and of course it included text and stories about Dr. Parker's background, which were really central to this story because he is a part of his story. And it's not just a story about a gold-plated cyborg, which is incredible. It's about survival, it's about human connection, and it's about Dr. Parker's drive to create technology that will improve the lives of people around him. So learning about his research in the context of his quest makes it all the more amazing. And this is my last piece, my last slide. So I would be remiss if I didn't mention the future of storytelling. Since we're in this crazy 21st century digital age where things change every day, there are always new technologies coming out. So we want to be up to date with those and know what tools are available to us, simply so that we know how we can best tell our story. But the basic principles of storytelling are never going to go away. Those are always going to be important. So set out to share your enthusiasm and your authenticity, share your passion with the world. If you shine your light, then people will see it, and it will bring other people alive, and everyone's waiting to hear your story. So I hope that you have fun telling it. And that's all. Thank you so much. Can I take questions? Or are there any questions? I don't know if I have time for questions.
Any questions or?
Thank you.
Sure. Here's a question for you. You showed us a lot of videos during your presentation. Also showed some really good still visuals. How do you balance between kind of still visuals, dynamic visuals, and maybe less for you in particular, but also kind of interactive visuals? So how do you kind of decide which one to go with, when to use how to best tell your story?
They're not up there.
Sometimes when you start working with the team, the experts, the scientist, the researcher, they actually have material already, or they have something which helps you get a better understanding of how they've been capturing the information. So with Dr. Parker, I will say he did have some videos already. He had some photos already. He actually had an artist in his lab helping him to document his work, which isn't very common, but he understood the importance of that. So sometimes you have some material to work with and you realize, oh, I can see this stingray moving. We could probably get something really incredible if we got a team with great lighting and great cameras. Other times it's a matter of working with the team that you're working with. So when I was at Science, we had Alberto running the graphics team. I was working on the photos, had a separate video team. So often it's just getting everyone in a room, like all the experts on each piece, and having them weigh in and say, oh, I think there's a video here, or no, we don't need to do it for this one. Otherwise, I think it really is just going with the source material, whether it's a paper or the data, and just thinking through it and getting a sense for what's the best way to present that. But it is different every time.
Okay, just not press that button.
We got it. Possibly, maybe. We'll see how long it lasts. All right, good afternoon. As Leah said earlier, she was worried she was holding you up before lunch. I'm holding you up before beers, so that's just the way it is. Before I get into it, I just want to, I think we should have a round of applause for the organizers, Sarah, Joanna, Mark, Paul, Beth, the South Big Data Hub, the West Big Data Hub, AAAS. Thank you. It's been a pretty exciting day, I'd have to say. But for me, whenever I go to these data storytelling workshops or conferences, people get excited about telling stories with data. It's a big buzzword, and so I come to these events like this. I'm angry right away. So that was me this morning, and I love Marie, and I love some of the stuff we saw, and I love Mike Pack's work, but we fail in a lot of these workshops and conferences to define what we mean by telling stories with data and what data stories mean and what the phrase data-driven journalism means. So I was tweeting out a little bit, these are the sorts of things that we were talking about this morning. When we think about data stories, we immediately think about exploration. I don't think about stories as exploration at all. That's not how I think about stories. When I think about stories, I think about something different. Mike said this morning, the real storytelling comes when you distill it down so that the public and policymakers can understand it. No, I don't think that's storytelling either. I think as researchers and analysts and data specialists, we can also understand storytellers. It's not about simplifying and distilling things down. We also heard this morning we don't need to tell one story, we're going to help people tell their own stories, and I think that's certainly true, but I think what we're often trying to do is we're trying to make an argument or a point. So we heard lots of words like this, like data and policymaker and narrative and digestible and graph and all these fun little buzzwords, but they're really not getting at the core of the question, which is what is a story as it applies to data? And as people who are engaged with data and analyzing data and publishing data, that is our core question, that is our core concern. So we look at graphs like this, and these are the sorts of things that we saw this morning. This is the dashboard from DEMPED that Marie works on. This is one of the graphs from Science that we saw. This is one from Mike Pack. These are all the things that people were showing and talking about, saying, we're telling a story here. Look, we're telling a story. From my mind, this is not a story. This is a visualization. It shows some data. Maybe it makes a point or an argument, but it's not telling a story. And what I'm going to try to do is have my own definition of story. We've seen now two. I'm going to show my own definition of the story and encourage you to think very carefully about how you use that word story. Because if we're not careful about how we use the word story and what we mean by telling stories with data, then we're not going to do a very good job of doing so. So I was pleasantly surprised this afternoon when we actually started talking about data. We started talking about stories and what that means. So Shannon unfortunately left, but I really like this slide that he put up where he shows on the left this graphic, and then he says when he talks about it, he starts with this story of his grandfather. However, he then sort of rips apart this graphic here and says, I hate infographics. And I'm pointing at you because Shannon's not here. I'd point at him, but I'm going to point at you because you cheered. Let me tell you something. That's an infographic. It's an infographic. He in the next sentence defined an infographic as a combination of data and pictures and text. There's data, there's pictures, and there's text. There are good and bad infographics, just like there are good and bad dashboards, just like there are good and bad data analysts out there. There's a difference between an infographic that's good and an infographic that's bad. You can still have a very good tower infographic. That's what he sort of hates, is these tower ones that tend to be in the marketing and the business world. But let's not say I don't like infographics because I don't like the word infographics or what we think they represent, because by that strict definition, this is an infographic. Okay, so Shannon also defined how he defines stories as these seven pieces. I'm more or less like most of these, although I probably strike out a few of them. Chrissy shared these 6 with us just moments ago. I also like these 6, except a lot of the things that she showed maybe out of the wheelhouse for many of us in this room. A lot of us aren't photo editors. A lot of us don't have a digital team behind us. We don't have photo editor teams. We're not going out and putting our hands in the jaws of alligators. So that's probably a little outside our realm. So as an economist and as someone who spends a lot of time doing research, I think I probably think about this a little bit differently. So now, so what I like about this slide is that we have the same picture. So we're both big fans of Unsplash, which is great. You know, same point, right? We've been telling stories for thousands of years, which is great. You know, we drew it on cave drawings. We told stories around the fire. We read them in the news. We tell stories through film. We tell stories through song. And the question is, what do we mean by stories? I have a friend at the Urban Institute who, also an economist, who used to work at the Council of Economic Advisors under the Obama administration. And she was often tasked with doing work on Native American reservations, specifically how children on the Native American reservations would grapple with issues of poverty and unemployment and alcoholism. And she would do some work, or she and the team would do some work, then something else would come up, and that research would go to the bottom of the pile. They'd come back to it sometime later, something else would come up, it'd go back to the bottom of the pile. And then at one point in 2014, the president and the first lady went to one of these Native American reservations in the Dakotas and sat down and spoke with children on some of these reservations. And it was their stories that really changed his focus, and by consequence changed how the CEA focused on it, and by consequence changed federal policy. So when he came back, the Post wrote this: when President Obama visited the Standing Rock tribal nation in June, he and the First Lady emerged stunned and emotional from a meeting with 6 students who spoke of lives affected by homelessness, alcoholism, poverty, and suicide. So it's these stories that move us. It's these stories that can spur us to action. But a story is not just a graph, okay? When we make our line graphs and our bar charts and our pie charts and our maps, we're not necessarily telling a story. We're just making a point, or we're just showing data. When I talk to friends in the data visualization field, I say, okay, how do you think about telling stories with data? And all the time they'll say, well, what I'm going to do is I'm going to start with a graph, and I'm going to build things up. I'm going to take a PowerPoint slide, for example. I'll build things up. It's something I call layering, but Edward Tufte calls it a dreaded build, however you want to call it. But you know, we make graphs like this, you know, all the time. Most of us aren't, you know, photoshopping or, you know, taking pictures and making documentaries. We're all making graphs like this all the time. And so I talk to people, you know, is this a story? They think about it for a second and say, no, it's not a story. Okay, so how would you tell a story with this? Well, most people say, okay, well, I would start with this graph. I'd start with this space. And then I would plot one line. And then I would plot another line. And then I have a story. And if we're really good, maybe we'd add some annotation to the graph, which far too few of us do, far too infrequently, right? This is still not a story. Okay, this is an argument that has some text on it, okay? It's not a story. And we are using, as people who use this term, data-driven stories or storytelling with data, we use those phrases far too flippantly, far too carelessly. And if we were careful about it, and if we thought carefully about it, we would then create data-driven stories with certain things in mind, the sort of thing that Christy showed, and a few things I'm going to show you in a moment. So, okay, so what is story? So how do we define story? You see now you'll see sort of 3 definitions. So there's a lot of different models of story. We can start all the way back with Aristotle, who defined a whole story as that which has a beginning, a middle, and an end. That is not particularly satisfying to me. Lunch had a beginning, a middle, and an end. It's not a story, right? So for me, there are 2 pieces. There are 2 core defining attributes of a story. The first thing is that it has emotion. And I'm not talking about sort of shallow emotion. I'm talking about deep emotion that gets you to care, that encourages you, spurs you to do something. If I were to show you, are the Tableau folks still here? The Tableau folks left. If I showed you a graph of Tableau stock price, right, the Tableau folks would have cried when it dropped by 50% last year. But if you hold stock and click, you would have been super happy, right? But that's not like a visceral, deep, emotional experience that spurs you to action. So that's what I'm really thinking about. So in Will Storr's book, The Unpersuadables, which is a great book and even more relevant today, He writes, a story is a description of something happening that contains some form of sensation or drama. And he continues, it is, in other words, an explanation of cause and effect that is soaked in emotion. And it's this soaked in emotion, I think, is the first defining characteristic of a story. The sort of thing that Christy showed you and talked about, but we don't necessarily need to have video and sound and all these sort of extras. We can still soak things in an emotion with using data visualizations as long as we're careful about our definitions. The second characteristic for me of story is to have a meaningful climax. That we're building towards something, so that people will stay engaged and that climax will be meaningful to them. In his terribly long, painful book, Story, Robert McKee writes, a story is not an accumulation of information strung into a narrative, but a design of events to carry us to a meaningful climax. And it doesn't mean that we have a sequential story. Stories don't necessarily have to be sequential, but they still have to drive to this meaningful climax. If you remember the old Choose Your Own Adventure books, you get to pick your path, but each path drives towards a meaningful climax. It also doesn't mean that we necessarily know the specific ending of the story. If you remember Lost in Translation, we don't actually know what Bill Murray says to Scarlett Johansson, but it's still a meaningful climax to us. It also doesn't mean that we don't necessarily know the ending of the story. If you remember American Beauty, this is going to ruin the end for those who haven't seen the movie, that's like 20 years old. He says at the very beginning that he's going to die. So it's not like we don't know, it's not that the story, we might know how it's going to end, but the story's still going to be emotional and it's still going to drive to a meaningful climax. But when we show these graphs, that's not what we're doing. In part because we're putting the whole thing on the page or on the screen so that you can't get to that meaningful climax because you can see it almost immediately. You can see that this line is going up. You can see this line is going down. You can see California and New York are the dark blue states, and these other states are lighter. So if we continue to think about data and stories, we also, not only do we need to define story, we need to think about story structure. And there's lots of models of story structure, and I'm just going to show you a few of them. The first one is Joseph Campbell's The Hero's Journey. And so Campbell's structure can be essentially drawn out in a circle where we start sort of at the top, and the protagonist or the central character is going to move from an ordinary world into a special world. And the protagonist is going to move around this circle. We're going to start at the status quo. There's going to be a call to adventure. The protagonist is going to leave, depart. There's going to be a crisis in this special world. The special world can be mental. It could be physical. And then we're going to have a return and a resolution. So you can think of Lord of the Rings. So Frodo's living the good life as a hobbit in the Shire, right? Drinking the big things of beer. He has a call to adventure. He departs in the special world, which, you know, is Mordor, which is Arendelle. There's a crisis, there's fights, and then he returns. So that's one model of story. Another model of story is from Kurt Vonnegut. And I'm not going to show you this great video that he has talking about story, but it is a great video that you should check out. Just, you know, Google Vonnegut and story. But Vonnegut also draws out story structure, which is great for people like us who are into data visualization. So these are sorts of the ways that he draws these out. So we have a vertical axis here, which we go from ill fortune to good fortune. We also have a horizontal axis where we go from the beginning to the end. Okay, and so one of Vonnegut's story structures, the boy gets girl, what we have is we start someday we're above average. Okay, the guy finds something wonderful. Okay, and then as Vonnegut tells us, he says, and then, oh God damn it, something bad happens. Okay, and then we end up coming back up and got it back again. Okay, so this is the classic boy gets girl story. It doesn't have to be about a boy getting a girl. It doesn't have to be about a girl getting a boy, but it's this core story structure. So that's two models. The last one I want to show you, and this is the model that you've already seen, and now I'm going to apply it to data. So this is Freytag's pyramid. Christy showed this. This is the final model I'm going to show you. And Freytag's pyramid, I'm going to dive in just a little bit more. So we have 5 parts to this story structure. First, we have the exposition. And this introduces the important background information. So this is how we start up the story. We lay out the information. We then have rising action, which is a series of events that are building towards the point of greatest interest. And the point of greatest interest, that's the climax of the story. And then on the other side of the mountain, we make our way down into following action, in which case the protagonist, the conflict between the protagonist and our antagonist unravels, and then finally we have the resolution. So that's Freytag's pyramid. And it's a common model story structure. And so if it's a model story structure, we should be able to apply Freytag's pyramid to data. Because if we're going to say data stories, then they should match up. But they don't. So let's apply this basic story structure pyramid to data. What's the exposition? Well, that's the background information, so that might be our space. The axes, the grid lines, the plot region. Now what's the rising action? Well, those you could think of those maybe as a supporting fact, so that might actually be plotting the data. Okay, what's the climax? Well, those are the main insights. Now, of course, most of us, this is kind of an aside here, actually. Most of us don't actually tell the reader what the main insight is. We're like, here's a graph, good luck to you, I'm going home, okay? So we actually we do a poor job, I think, and we being like the world, but especially researchers and data analysts, we do a poor job of actually telling our audience what we want them to learn. The climax here is the main insights. Okay, what's on the other side? I don't know what the following action is. There's no resolution here. What's the next steps? Again, we don't really tell people what the next steps are, but we just sort of, thank you for looking at our graph. So instead of thinking of data stories as a thing that we're not defining, I want to encourage you thinking of an alternative framework. And I'm basing this framework on a discussion Alberto Cairo had on a podcast and one that he also wrote about. In which case, we don't just think about everything as a data story, where we actually build out a spectrum of different types of ways we communicate data. We look from annotation to narration to story along a spectrum. And so annotation might be something where you put markers or text on a graph to help your audience understand how to read the graph and also how to get the content out of that graph. As we move from annotation to narration, this is where we might guide the reader through. We help move them along the graph itself or the series of graphs. Then to move to narration to story, this is where we add the emotion and the meaningful climax, okay? Now, before I lay out examples of the three, I want to take this axis and I want to pair it with a couple of other things. The first thing I want to pair it with is an axis that goes from data to people. So I'm an economist, and so I spend most of my time working with data. And this is what my colleagues and I do. We grab a bunch of census data, we grab a bunch of data, we analyze it, run some regressions, write a report, what have you. And yeah, someone answered the survey question, but we don't really care all that much, right? Like, it's data, it's good data, so who cares who answered it, right? But there are people back there. On the other side are people or units or groups where we actually get their individual experience, their individual behaviors. And if you think about the people who are working along this spectrum, we can add a third line here. We have on this side are the analysts. So we are downloading data, we're making dashboards, we're making line charts, we're making bar charts. And then on the far other side, I use the word journalists basically as a placeholder, but journalists are actually talking to people. They're actually going out there and interviewing and getting their stories. Stories as it's well defined. So if we take two of these axes and put them together, we end up with this little XY space. And so what we have had to date are analysts living down here in this bottom left quadrant. We get some data, we make a pivot table, we run some means, we run a regression, and then we make a graph. And that's what we've done. It's not a story. On the far right, on the upper right part of this graph, we have journalists who have been for a long time interviewing people and telling their stories and reporting about them. Bob is unemployed in West Virginia. You go interview Bob and you tell Bob's story. What we have seen over the last 5 or 10 years especially is that journalists are moving down along this diagonal, right? They're learning how to code. They're learning how to work with data. A lot of the innovation in the field of data visualization is coming from the journalism field. The Post, the Times, the Guardian, ProPublica, the LA Times, the Tampa Bay Tribune, and many others. Science. I missed someone else. Who did I miss? I mentioned John. I mentioned the Post. Okay, so we're good. And what has not happened, however, is analysts have not been really doing a good job of moving up towards the center. Yes, there are qualitative researchers among us. Economists make fun of them all the time. But we are still not yet doing a very good job of pairing those together. And in a world where individual stories can be more important because they have that emotion and they can have that meaningful climax, it's becoming more and more important for each of us to try to land in the middle of this space. So in this conversation I had with Alberto, he tweeted me and said, journalists need more nuance and less story, and analysts need more story and less needless nuance. It's the combination, it's the merging of the two that I think can help us to better define what a story is, so that we can bring the individual stories with the data, so that we don't just talk to Bob in West Virginia, but we also back it up with data about the state as a whole. I talked to Sarah Cliff about this, Sarah Cliff at Vox, who does a lot of work on healthcare, about this very topic. And earlier in the year, Sarah had done a bunch of stories on why counties that had a high percentage of people who voted for Donald Trump also have high rates of health insurance through the ACA, and so why is there this disconnect? And she did a bunch of great stories where she actually identified those counties where you see this disconnect, through the data, by looking at the data, and then she went into certain counties in West Virginia and Kentucky and actually talked to people. And so Sarah says that data defines the parameters of the story. And that's what can allow us to then go in, use the data as the objective piece to help define the parameters of the story, and then we can go and talk to people and help buttress the analysis with the individual behaviors, individual stories that can make it meaningful and build to a meaningful climax. Okay, so what I want to do to just finish up is to show you examples of along this spectrum of how I view the difference between annotation, narration, and story. So let's start with annotation. This is perhaps my favorite example of expert annotation. This is a bubble chart from the LA Times. What we have here along the horizontal axis is the rate of change, the change in the violent crime rate. And in the vertical axis is the change in the property crime rate for about 30, 35 cities in California. Now, everyone here in this room is best fitting the lines of the bubble plot. That's what you're all doing. I can see mental regressions going on right now. Everybody's calculating slopes. But the average reader of the LA Times may not be doing that, may not even know how to read this graph, right? They've never seen a graph like this before. So notice the expert annotation on this graph. You come to this graph, and there's a big red box in the top right quadrant with a big red word that says worse. And then in the lower left quadrant is a big blue box with a big blue word that says better. So even if you've never seen a chart like this before, you know that that stuff up there is bad and that stuff over here is good. And then on top of that, it gives you these small bold-faced headlines and a sentence or two below that describes the content, that describes the actual story here, the actual argument of this graphic, so that we have annotation here that delivers how to read the visualization, but also how to get the content out of the visualization. Okay, what about narration? So narration, again, is taking annotation one step further, where we're going to guide the reader or guide the user through the visualization. This is a piece from Hannah Fairfield and some colleagues at the Times from 2014 on the healthcare law, which, based on what's going on right now, this seems quaint by comparison, but we'll go with it anyways. Notice that we have here is we have a bunch of graphs on the right side and paragraphs of text on the left side that describe each graph. They tell you what's going on in each graph, and you could ignore the gratuitous D3 animations. But the point is here is that this is not a story. It's just describing each graph step by step. I did a somewhat similar project last year at Urban, where we had graphs on the disability insurance program where each graph was making a point or showing something or making an argument, and each graph was tagged with some explanatory text. It's not a story. Too many people say that's a story. It's not a story just because you have to scroll through it and because there's a bunch of words on the page. It's not a story. It's just a bunch of points. It's just a bunch of facts. It's a bunch of visuals. There's nothing wrong with it. It's just not a story. Okay, so finally we come to it. So what is story? So I think still to this day, the best data visualization story, data-driven story, is Snowfall from the Times. So Snowfall, if you recall, published in December of 2012, combined video, graphics, static and interactive, audio, and text about the deaths of skiers in some a mountain range outside of in the Pacific Northwest. So what I want to do is I want you to listen to the first part, the first two paragraphs of this news article. And this, for me, is how I define a story, because you're going to see how it's immediately emotional, you immediately care, and it's going to drive, just from the beginning, you can see how it's going to drive towards a meaningful climax.
The snow burst through the trees with no warning, but a less-second whoosh of sound, a two-story wall of white, and Chris Rudolph's piercing cry, avalanche, Elise. The very thing the 16 skiers and snowboarders had sought, fresh, soft snow, instantly became the enemy. Somewhere above, a pristine meadow cracked in the shape of a lightning bolt, slicing a slab nearly 200 feet across and 3 feet deep. Gravity did the rest. Snow shattered and spilled down the slope. Within seconds, the avalanche was the size of more than 1,000 cars barreling down the mountain and weighed millions of pounds. Moving about 70 miles an hour, it crashed through the sturdy old-growth trees, snapping their limbs and shredding bark from their trunks. The avalanche in Washington's Cascades in February slid past some trees and rocks like ocean swells around a ship's prow. Others it captured and added to its blunt float. Somewhere inside, it also carried people. How many? No one knew.
So right away, you want to read this story, because it's a story. Yes, that has data with it, but at its core, it's a story, because it's about people, it's about their behavior, their experience. Okay, so at the end, so what? Right, so we all seem to know what a data story is. We all seem to say, oh yeah, it's a story with data. Yeah, okay, I read it, it's a story. It's a graph. Okay, I know what a story is. My mom read me stories when I was a kid. I read stories to my kids. I know what a story is. We all kind of know what we're talking about. It's fine. I think we need to be more careful about how we use this word story as it applies to data. Because if we are more careful about it, we then take a graph and we use it for what it is, that it's a point, that it's an argument. And instead, if we say, we're going to tell stories of data, we're actually going to try to tell those stories. We are going to try to have content that is emotional. We're going to try to have content that builds to a meaningful climax. Tyler Cohen once wrote that stories to work have to be simple, easily grasped, easily told to others, and easily remembered. That's what takes these stories and allows us to circulate them and to share them and to move our content further and further. But it's not because we have some data on a page. It's because we've thought about how people interact with us, how people behave, and their stories. In his book About Story, John writes, all tales then are at some level a journey into the woods to find the missing part of us, to retrieve it and to make ourselves whole. It's about us telling stories about people around us, about experiences around us, so that we can connect with our reader, connect with our user, connect with our audience. We are all storytellers. We all work with data, and we can all make graphs, we can all make maps, we can all make line charts. We can also talk to people. We can also find out what's going on behind the data. And we can combine those two together so that we can deliver meaningful content that people will recognize, that they will recall, and that they can share. Thank you very much.
Question from the website.
Yep.
What's the difference between a journalist and an analyst in the field? So the journalist may have a lot of time to work on a single story, whereas the analysts have a lot of data. Sometimes we stratify by age group, race, ethnic group, disability status, poverty, education, attainment, and or geography. How would you recommend culling through the noise to do a better job of storytelling? There's so many permutations through it.
So how many journalists are in the room? Just one? Others aren't raising their hand, John, I'm pretty sure. I would guess that John and who are the other hiding journalists would disagree that they have ample time to work on stories. Right? I mean, sometimes, right? Like the power plant one probably had time to do it, but.
Oh, well, that one we did.
Well, so there you go. Okay.
There's times we've had more time, but that one we didn't have any.
So, so that would be my first point, but I don't think, I mean, look, I'm not saying that there's anything wrong with the line chart or that there's anything wrong with the table. If you have, you're looking at, let's just make it easy, you're looking at differences in income by, gender, age, and ethnic groups, a bar chart may be perfectly fine. A line chart may be perfectly fine. There's nothing wrong. I'm just saying that that's not a story. Okay, and if we want that to be a story, then what we need to do is go deeper into the data or deeper and talk to actual people to find out what does it mean if you're a low-income minority living in downtown and living in Anacostia. What does that mean for you? What does that mean as you walk down the streets? Again, I'm not trying to say that what we do can't be stories, because it can, and I'm not saying what we often do, what we do 99% of the time, is wrong in any way. I make graphs all the time. It's just that we need to be very careful about how we think about this word story so that we use it more purposefully and we use it more strategically. Were there any questions? Yeah.
So one thing that I think creates some of the tension between data where you aggregate over something that is potentially a lot of different stories, and the story is just the density and the complexity, and how do you pack all of that and pull out the nuance and separate it. So would like a good approach to data storytelling be to try and pick out some prototypical cases, so some typical cases, and then complement that with a more traditional narrative? Or what would you say is the recipe for dealing with kind of the bandwidth issue when you're dealing with data which really has a lot of different stories embedded with it?
Yeah, that's a great question. So I think this comes up a lot when I talk to people who are working with qualitative data, because in some ways it's like the flip. I have qualitative data, but I want to summarize it quickly. If I have quantitative data, I can take means or medians and I can make a table, no problem. If I have qualitative data, it's sort of hard to do that. So I think your suggestion, your point is the right one, which is we have all these data, we're trying to summarize it, but how do we get people to engage with it? How do we get them to care about it? Well, we say, here's mean whatever, here's the average whatever, here's an example of a person who, here's the average person, here's the person at the 10th percentile, and here's, then you can contrast the experiences, and that's how you then start to tell a story. Within the first few months of joining Urban, I was asked to review some people's presentations, and whenever you talk to economists and researchers, it's the same thing, right? It's like, here's my introduction, here's the previous literature, here's the data, here's the methods, here's the results, right? It's the same formula that just puts everyone to sleep. And it was fine, whatever. Nothing stood out. And then after the formal presentation practice, we were sitting around talking about it, and the senior researcher and the junior staff were talking about how this was a qualitative data collection effort where they went to different states and cities and they talked to families who were receiving welfare benefits, basically. They were receiving welfare benefits, and how, they talked to one family where it's a single mom with 3 kids, and she had to take all these buses to get to the city center so that she could get her government benefits. And they're telling all these stories, and I'm like, who cares about the tables? Right? People can go read a 200-page report. They're not going to read it, but they can go read the 200-page report. It's the stories that really makes us care. And so, yes, you could have the bar chart that has the summary statistics of the average income for these 6 cities. But what's going to get people to care about it is that you told this story about the single mom and how she had to do this and her challenges, and then why this whole argument that you're making in the 199 other pages is meaningful and relative and related to people's experience. One more thing. Okay.
Is it always appropriate to tell a story? When do you differentiate, now I'm going to tell a story, now I'm going to just give you
Yeah.
Yeah, how do you make that?
Right, yeah. So no, you don't always have to tell a story. Sometimes, so I have lots of people who come to me and they say, can you help me we want to build an interactive online data tool. We saw the power plant piece in the post. We want to build something like that. And you say, okay, so who are you communicating with? Who's your audience? They say, well, we're a nonprofit. We have have 4 people, we work with, 15 homeless shelters, and we want to share this information, this particular thing. And you're like, you just need a bar chart. But a bar chart's going to do what you need to do. If you look on Twitter, sometimes the most powerful things are not stories and videos. It's like the graph that really tells that thing. Like in John's talk earlier, you had this really cool map that really engaged you, but from that one tweet, it was the line chart that was really the thing that really mattered, or the thing that was the most important aspect of that piece. So I would say no, it's not always important to tell a story. Sometimes you just want to make an argument that this thing is going up, that this thing is going down, that our revenues are going up, that we're not doing a good job. Sometimes we're just making a point or just making an argument. It doesn't always have to be a story. And again, and the other thing I would say is that sometimes telling these stories I think telling the stories is always harder, and it could also be more time consuming. It can also be more expensive, and we don't all have photographers and video journalists surrounding us that can help us. And a lot of us who are working with data, we don't always know we're not journalists. So we don't necessarily know how to find the person in Maine who's undergoing this thing so that we can talk to them about it. So not only do we all need to move towards the center in terms of that XY space I showed, we also probably need to move together a little bit in terms of our shared skills space so that the journalists become more astute with data, and we as analysts become more astute and and better able to talk to people and understand their stories. You're welcome. Any other questions? Okay, thank you very much.
Thank you, John. What a wonderful way to wrap up our day, and I hope he gave you something to think about.